He can wait.
Just so he doesn't.
Yeah. Good morning, everyone. We do have quorum. I would like to call this meeting to order. I would like to welcome everyone to the 25th meeting of the Licensing Standards Committee. As chair of the committee, I would like to extend a warm welcome to members of the public and those watching the proceedings online or TV. As usual, I would like to remind everyone that you can find the agenda for today's meeting and follow the meeting in real time at www.toronto.ca/council. The Licensing Standards Committee gratefully acknowledges that we're meeting on the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the New Credit Nation, the Haudenosaunee, and the Huron-Wendat, and home of the many diverse indigenous peoples. Any conflicts of interest or any declarations under the Municipal Conflict of Interest Act? Seeing none, none noted. Can I have a motion to confirm the minutes of the Licensing Standards Committee meeting of April the 10th? Deputy Mayor Glenda de Beremaker. All those in favor? Against? Carried. Thank you. Speakers. We have a list of speakers on, actually we have 4 items. So I'll go through the agenda. Item 1. LS 25.1, mitigating the negative impacts of extreme heat in apartment buildings. We have 1 speaker, so that item is going to be held. LS 25.2, review of Fraternity and Sorority houses exemption to Chapter 285, rooming houses. We have a number of speakers. That item is being held as one. LS 25.3, review Municipal Code Chapter 447, fences. We have 4 speakers. That item is being held. And the last item, LS 25.4, amendments to Chapter 740, street vending portrait artists. We have 1 speaker. So all the items are being held. Communications, do we have any communications?
They've been distributed in this package. They've been distributed to members. So there's this and that.
So we do have some communications on item number 1, and those communications have been distributed to the members of the committee for your reference. Great.
The communications are also on item number 2, 3, and 4. There's communications on every.
Yeah, I've been advised that we have communications on all the 4 items. So we'll get to the speakers list, and then we'll deal with the first one, LS 25.1, mitigating the negative impacts of extreme heat in apartment buildings. And we have 1 speaker, and that's Daryl Chong from the Greater Toronto Apartment Association. My friends, before I get to that, is on behalf of the Vice Chair, Councillor Jim Karijanis. He regrets for not being able to be here today, and he had some sort of allergic reaction. He's in the hospital right now. So having said that, let's get on with the meeting. Good morning.
Good morning, Chair Palacio. Thank you very much, members of the committee, staff. As you know, the GTA represents the owners and managers of about 150,000 apartment units. These buildings vary considerably in shape and size. The one common element is they're mostly 45 to 60 years old. But our engineers and our facilities staff know these buildings well, and I'm here to offer any sort of technical assistance you may need and access to our mechanical systems as part of your interdivisional working group. Additionally, the GTA is here to help educate building owners regarding the heat requirements. I know you're proposing some changes to the bylaw, and I know there was some issues this past September. Unfortunately, most of our building staff are kind of hardwired after years and years of setting this September 15th date in their minds. that they ramp up and they plan and schedule maintenance with service providers, mechanical systems providers, and so on. And that's done months, maybe a year in advance. And so things are scheduled, and they don't have, they should have more flexibility in terms of when things go on and off, but they just do it the same way every year. And this year showed that a little more education is required, and here to offer our assistance as an association of private sector owners to make sure the right messaging gets out. Additionally, we will continue to work with Toronto Public Health on their education campaigns. We did so last year, and we're continuing this year. And we are just basically here to say, whatever you need, let us know. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions to the deputant? Yes, we have Deputy Mayor Libermaker. Please go ahead.
Through you, Madam Speaker, sorry. Through you, Mr. Chair. Thank you very much for coming in today. In terms of the report, then, you're here happy with or supporting the staff recommendations?
Well, there's a series of recommendations. The main one is that the staff are going to create an interdivisional working group to look at sort of long-term solutions. And I'm here, yes, like I said, I'm here to offer assistance in that regard. The other recommendations, do you want me to go through each of them, or that one?
No, I just...
That was the main one, yes.
So do you think, I think because we all realize many of the apartment buildings, like you said, are 50 or 60 years old. Certainly in my ward, I think most of them were built without air conditioning. Just wasn't a thing back in the 50s as much. So are you happy with some of the recommendations that say apartment building owners are required to provide either air conditioning per unit or a cooling, I think we call it a cooling room, so that people, say in one of the buildings in my ward, if it's really hot and they're elderly, if they don't have air conditioning, they can go down to, say, the main foyer or another room designated by the landlord in compliance with their act, so that they can get some relief from those stifling hot days?
Yes, in most cases, that's exactly what Toronto Public Health reported out in May of last year. They recommended, and we're working with them to try to ensure that most buildings, if not all buildings, have such a facility on site. If not part of Toronto Public Health's campaign, their current campaign is identifying to all citizens of the city where the nearest cooling relief center is. But yes, but also the buildings are old. They were built without any central ductwork. That's the biggest hurdle here, and without the electrical capacity for window units in every window. It's a mechanical, logistic sort of issue.
Okay, great. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Councilor DiGiorgio, you're next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chong, one of the recommendations is that municipal license and standards will actually conduct a better education program to tell people in the apartments that, in fact, a landlord does not necessarily have to turn on the heat from September 15th to June 1st. Help me understand, what kind of discretion does that give the landlord? I understand that if it's warm out, you shouldn't have to turn on the heat, but with the weather the way we have in Canada, the weather is warm one day and then all of a sudden it's cold the next day. So how do you, as a landlord, how do you deal with that provision that says you have to have the heat on?
Well, so yeah, it's a bit more complicated than just turning on and off a switch. For a very large building that's hydronically heated, and that's pumped water through coils, it takes about 3 days to ramp up the heat in that water system to fill the whole building. So you kind of lead up to that. So you can't just turn it on today and expect it to be hot tomorrow or later today. It doesn't work like that. There is some lead time, and that varies from building to building. So unfortunately, people are just, the staff in these buildings just do it September 15th as per the bylaw. They just get everything ready and start turning it on.
I guess my question is this. Notwithstanding that there's some discretion for a landlord not to necessarily have the heat on, who bears the burden of where there's a sudden switch in temperature and the heat is required? Like, is it the landlord that has to sort of look on a weekly basis as to the forecast, so that if the forecast is deemed to be colder in the next week, you've got to automatically ramp up?
Right.
As opposed to municipal licensing having to take the burden.
I think we could, as an association, could take the lead on making sure they understand what they need to do and what they should be doing. instead of them just relying on what they do every year.
All right, thanks.
Any other questions? If not, I think that I have one, Mr. Chen, for you. The report recommends that staff develop an interdivisional working group to identify the strategies to address excessive indoor temperature, especially during the, of course, the summer months. And how does your Toronto Apartment Association feel about that, this working group?
Yeah, so I'm here to offer our assistance. We know, our staff know the systems, we have professional engineers that service these buildings on a daily basis. They know the systems well, and we're here to offer some technical assistance if you need it.
So would you be willing to be part, or your association to be part of this working group as well?
Absolutely, if invited.
Great, fantastic, thank you. Any other questions? If not, thank you for your presentation.
Thank you.
So I think that's, that will be it for item number 1. Questions to staff? Yes, we have, Councilor Francis-Sierra. Please go ahead.
Yes, thank you. So last Friday at council, there was a member's motion that was presented, moved by Councilor Matlow and seconded by myself. So the staff know about that recommendation, and I guess that just complements your report, correct? And it's authorizing the medical officer of health in consultation with the executive director to establish heat alert days. Correct. So you're okay, like, with this motion being passed today as part of this report to staff?
So to you, Mr. Chair, I'm not aware of that motion being a part of the item today.
Yeah, it is. It was passed Friday, late Friday.
Yeah.
It was passed late Friday, and it was passed by council.
Yeah, I do know that motion. I didn't realize it was on this agenda.
No, it's not.
Passed, yeah.
But I just wanted to bring it forward as part of this agenda because it is part of your report.
Gotcha. Yes, through you, Mr. Chair. We are aware, and yes, Councillor Nunziata, it does complement some of the recs where we've spoken about in recommendation 4, partners with this notion of education to the landlords and property operators, that they have that flexibility. This motion does add an additional notion of a heat alert day, which is different than the current extreme heat. I'll be meeting with the Chief Medical Officer of Health to figure out what that looks like. But it is intended to the same purpose, is to make sure landlords know that they have that flexibility when the temperatures change.
So public health is here, correct? So maybe we can have public health just comment?
Sure, through the chair, I support what was just explained, that it does complement the work that's been done, and it allows us through the interdisciplinary work group, as well as the 2 leads, the general manager and the medical officer of health, to deal with the challenges that happen at the beginning and end of the season that are difficult to manage, as we need to balance the need for, obviously, health and safety, but for feasibility and clarity of communication. So we have to do some work with the folks in Darrell Chung's association to make sure it's clear, and we appreciate the identification of this from council as an important issue, but we do need to work through how to make sure all those messages come across clearly, and we'll be doing that over the course of this next few weeks and over the summer.
Okay, thank you. So another question I have is recommendation 1B, require that all new apartment buildings have air conditioning and add measures that enable passive cooling. Would this recommendation be circulated to the planning department, so any new development applications that come in, that they ensure in fact that there is air conditioning included in their development application? Because I had an application just recently where there's no air conditioning being proposed, and this is a new building. So is this, you're going to be passed on to our planning staff as well that review all these new applications?
Through the chair to the councillor, the recommendation 1 is about for the working group to review the feasibility of these ideas and report back. So we're not suggesting here that we implement or require new buildings have these passive systems installed. It's to look at the feasibility of having such a requirement, and then we would report back to the Tenant Issues Committee on the findings of the working group and recommendations of perhaps changes that could be enacted either through our own bylaws, or perhaps there needs to be changes to Municipal Planning Act or site plan approval processes for new construction. So it's only to report back on the feasibility of having these types of measures implemented in new buildings.
I understand that the existing buildings, that it would be a little more difficult, but I don't see why a community working group will have to comment on new buildings. New buildings, it should be a given that there should be air conditioning in new buildings.
Well, through the,
I just don't understand that part.
part of this work,
Yeah.
through the chair of the councillor, is we have to look at what legislative authority the municipality may have for dealing with something like that. So the Building Code Act, for instance, regulates how new buildings are to be constructed, and they establish the minimum standards. So we'd have to review with legal if in fact the city has the authority to mandate air conditioning in new construction, and if we did, what that would look like.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Oh, yeah. Deputy Mayor DeBermeker, you're next, please.
Through you, Mr. Chair. Is it staff's opinion, based on what they've given us in the report, that putting in air conditioning in every unit in the city isn't practical and wouldn't work?
Through the chair to Councillor DeBermeker, yes, it's our opinion and recommendation that mandating air conditioning in all existing apartment buildings is not feasible for several reasons. One, the electrical infrastructure, both on the private side and on the municipal side, we don't believe, especially on the private side, does not have the capacity to handle that additional electrical load, and that would raise substantial upgrades and costs required for that work alone. The ultimate impact on the overall demands for the electrical network and generating capacity and greenhouse gas emissions, how that would be counter to our goals and the city's goals in that regard. The costs of doing those upgrades would be passed on directly to tenants as the current legislation exists, and that would be impact affordability issues, which we understand is of significant concern in the city. There's the issues of also, would it in fact achieve an effective cooling of those units, because those older buildings don't have proper insulation in the walls, leaky windows, so it may not even be as effective as believed.
Okay. And through you, Mr. Chair, it's always been my assumption of the applications in my ward in Scarborough Centre, I'll call it that they're virtually all condo buildings, but all the new high-rise buildings now do have air conditioning. Is it a requirement?
Through the chair to Councillor DeBermeker, no, it's not a requirement, but I think the marketplace drives that issue, and most people would be looking and expecting air conditioning in individual units in newly constructed buildings.
Okay. So then, at one level, if we were to retrofit the existing housing apartment stock, that might take us 50 to 100 years, even if it was an advisable thing to do. Because they'd have to retrofit the whole building envelope, the electrical system, do all sorts of things that maybe are almost physically impossible, but maybe over the next 100 years, we could see a retrofit of some of those buildings.
Yes, the time taken to do the retrofit when there's approximately 3,500 buildings in the city that this would impact would be very extensive. We do know from our apartment building registry data that 83% of those buildings, approximately 3,500 buildings, have hot water heating systems. So to air condition them would require a significant number of those buildings to have to install ductwork, do major retrofits within the building to accommodate that ductwork. Not even sure if it would be feasible or practical.
Okay, and through Mr. Chair, you're creating, I believe it's an interdivisional working group. Is that correct? Or is it a working group where you could have perhaps, I can't remember who you represent, Daryl, but the apartment building owners, apartment association, and people from Acorn on that committee sitting side by side with you? Or do you prefer a more, say, exclusive club of just our staff, and then you would bring in the building owners and Acorn and tenant reps and other people later on? Or would you like them there at the working group with you?
Through the chair to Councillor DeBaremaker, I think we're proposing, when we used the word interdivisional staff working group, that was to deal perhaps with some of the complexities of legal authorities and permissions we have, but we definitely would be inclusive in engaging with our partners, be the GTAA, Federation of Rental Properties of Ontario, FMTA, ACORN, and others that have that expertise and can bring to us so we can have a complete understanding of the issues and possible solutions and engaging with everybody.
So through you, Mr. Chair, if I can clarify, you will be creating a working group with all of those stakeholders present as well as yourselves? So there'll be two different stakeholder groups?
We have the working group of staff, but we would be then engaging with and or having dialogue with all the other various stakeholders to leverage their knowledge and experience.
If I can clarify, to me, there's a difference between, say, inviting people into a public meeting once to say, what are your thoughts, versus a working group that says we're going to meet once a month for the next 6 months and get into technical issues and exchange ideas. So are we having a working group where people sit there for 6 months together or a year together, or are we just going to host a public meeting or two where owners and tenants and everybody else can just show up and tell you what they think?
Sorry, through you, Mr. Chair. I think there's twofold here, Deputy Mayor DeBaremaker. What we're talking about in Rec 1 is actually to deal with the issue of heat more generally, more broadly. That's why it includes the Chief Resilience Officer, Medical Officer of Health, Energy, Environment Division. So we want to have an interdivisional group solely that looks at the legal authorities, but also fully what the city might be able to do to address the issue of maximum heats and indoor temperatures. Once we've gotten through that process, then there'll be a determination of what would be the next steps, whether or not that requires a full working group or with external parties, or whether we do that through a comprehensive consultation process. So this is step one, first for us to understand the full landscape of what we were asked to look at, bearing in mind that Rec 1A, B, and C were inputs directly from the Tenant Issues Committee. So we do have those other venues that we use to engage. So this one is for us to figure this out with all those pieces that are internal to the city, and then talk about what a consultation plan looks like. And it may include a working group as we go forward and marry this with the work that public health is also doing on maximum heats. So there's kind of a two-stepper to this. This is a complex issue we'll be working on for a while with a lot of people.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions? If not, I have one question. It's a follow-up to 1C, and this is a follow-up to the Deputy Mayor's questioning that all apartment buildings undergo retrofitting, and I'm referring mainly to Toronto Community Housing buildings. How many Toronto Community Housing buildings do we have in City of Toronto? I know that the city is the biggest landlord in the country, but do we have those numbers, 2,000?
Through the chair to the chair, my apologies. There's approximately 2,100 buildings that Toronto Community Housing has. Now, not all of those would fall under what we normally classify as an apartment building that our program applies to, but it's a substantial number nonetheless.
Okay, now the City of Toronto being a key shareholder and being the biggest landlord in terms of our own buildings, in terms of priorities for retrofitting these buildings, I'm just thinking of how soon are we planning to do that? Will this ever happen? The Deputy Mayor was talking about perhaps 100 years. And can we do it a little bit earlier than that in terms of retrofitting those buildings? Because that's actually where, when we listen carefully from our core, and I'm listening from my constituents all the time, they are the ones who are real suffering out there. So I really need some clarification in terms of moving forward. What kind of allocation of funding and whatever else, if we are getting that kind of conversation?
To the chair, I think before we can anticipate the timeline to implement it, we have to understand what ultimately would be the recommendations of implementing it. Because, having mandating air conditioning retrofits to existing buildings may not be the only solution. There can be other solutions that we may recommend that maybe are more feasible, more practical, and can be implemented in a shorter time frame. Cooling rooms, passive shading, other measures. So we have to evaluate, and as Executive Director Cook identified, it's a complex issue. That's why it's not a simple silver bullet, we'll fix everything here, put air conditioning in and everybody will work. So it's difficult to give that definitive answer of what the timeline is. So that's why we're saying, let us go away, do the work, come back with recommendations on the feasibility of things, including what would be the timeline to implement those.
On that one, as a former member of the Toronto Community Housing Board, there were recommendations to prioritize units where tenants had an opportunity to put air conditioning units within their windows, but something that complies with the existing codes. Do you know where that's falling? Are things falling apart or falling into place to accommodate that?
With respect to the tenants' ability to install their own air conditioning units in their units, whether they're window-mounted units or standalone units, that's between the landlord and the tenants. We don't get involved in that. We do know that quite a few buildings throughout the city do have them installed, so I can't really address fully the question that you've answered.
But wouldn't that be part of recommendation 1C, that all apartment buildings undergo retrofitting, and that will be part of the retrofitting, at least in my opinion, or I may be totally wrong, off track on this one. Yeah. I just want to have a good understanding on that.
So again, item 1C is we have to look at all the various options there, whether it's window-mounted air conditionings, ducted systems into the units, it could be one or the other.
Thank you. I have another question, in that I'm going to direct that one to the Toronto Public Health. And it's been noted in the past that the maximum indoor temperature standards for all apartment buildings are not being recommended. And I believe that comment came from the Toronto Public Health. Why is it? What are the reasons for that? Can you please clarify that?
Sure, through the chair. Could you just repeat the question so I'm clear what you're asking?
Yeah, setting the maximum indoor temperature standard for all apartment buildings was not recommended by the Toronto Public Health. What are the reasons for?
Sure. So through the chair, the reason that what we were asked to do was figure out what is the maximum temperature, so we knew what to aim for. But the feasibility of implementing that recommendation is one that we came to a conclusion with MLS staff, and along with landlords and all the other stakeholders. And the challenge that was described earlier by MLS staff is the same. To reach that goal, there are huge feasibility issues for landlords that have an effect on tenants, that could displace tenants, that have potential for great challenge with the electrical grid, and that really cause us to step back and look at the whole picture. That's why there's a recommendation to look at new builds and understand the feasibility of doing that. It is certainly a market demand. But then to take all the existing stock and look at short-term solutions, as were mentioned, such as a cooling room, using the new heat relief network that we're going to be promoting throughout the city, where we have all public space available, searchable on a website this year for the first time. And also to work with the Landlord Association, see if there's any other solutions we haven't thought of, because clearly straight going to air conditioning has a lot of unintended consequences. So it wasn't that we didn't recommend a temperature and that we didn't recognize there's risk, but it's a different question to figure out how to make that feasible in the existing stock, and it has to be done in partnership. And we know there's interest and urgency around this issue, but we have to make sure that we have not created any unintended consequences, the worst of which would be displacing residents. So we're going to work on that through the interdivisional committee, as well as with the stakeholders over the course of the next summer. And I understand the bylaw will be coming back to give you some solutions.
It will be fair to say that for technical and financial reasons, perhaps that's one of the reasons why you are taking the position?
I think I'd say that the position was taken because of potential unintended consequences of blindly implementing the temperature that we came to. It doesn't mean it isn't a risk, but it needs to be thought through, and I appreciate the work that MLS has done with us to help make that happen.
Thanks so much. Great. Any other questions, speakers, visiting members? If not, okay. And Speaker Nunciera, you're first.
Yes, thank you. I'll move the recommendation. I come in support of the recommendation. And, but I do have an amendment that I want to move, can have staff, and it goes back to the question that I asked, that to request the provincial government to amend the building code in all new apartments. I understand that the older buildings, that's going to be a little difficult. You know, some of the older buildings, which I have in my ward, and Councillor de Bearmaker, I think we all have them, right? But in the newer buildings, when applications are coming forward, I don't think there should be any reason at all why there shouldn't be air conditioning. I mean, I know that it's an additional cost, but, you know, I think that with what's happened in the past few years in some of these tenants and that are living in these buildings, that, you know, the complaints have come in when we have a heat wave and they have no way, and some of them you can't even open up the windows as well in some buildings. So I think that that's important, that we do request the provincial government to amend the building code, and we look at that, and that be part of the working group. But I think that, I don't even think that should even be considered by the working group. I think that they would support it. I think we should be doing it, and we should be requesting the provincial government to amend the building code. I think that's a given. I don't think that there's any argument or debate from anyone on that issue. Thank you.
Thank you. And the next speaker, Deputy Mayor de Bearmaker. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'll certainly support Councillor Nunziata's motion and the staff recommendations here. I think every councillor deals with this issue every year, and it's a reality of how complicated Mother Nature is, about living in an apartment is. We think there's a simple solution, or we can wave a magic wand and put an air conditioner in every unit, and then there won't be any problem anymore. But the reality is it's just not possible physically and from the electrical supply system. And even if we could do that, it wouldn't work, because the buildings they built 50 and 60 years ago aren't that insulated, aren't that energy efficient. So you can be blasting your air conditioner and it might bring the temperature down by 1 degree. Probably not even noticeable to most people. So I think this will be a challenge. I think of this spring, we had, I'm sure every office was inundated by very angry constituents when we had the last ice storm in April. We had sidewalks and lawns and everything covered with 2 inches of solid ice. I couldn't shovel my driveway or sidewalk the day of the ice storm. We had people very angry saying, and in fact the mayor's office intervened to get our works department to go and rehire some sidewalk plows to, in April, come and shovel snow. 7 days later, on April 22nd, what were we doing? Like I was out at a recycling day on Environment Day. People were getting sunburns because it was so sunny and it was so hot. So I can understand why in an old building, if on one Sunday you're turning up the heat to make sure people are still warm and comfortable, that 7 days later, or the next 3 days later, you've got people calling the landlord complaining that it's too hot. And the response is, well, we turned up the heat 3 days ago because there was an ice storm. 3 days later, there's a heat wave and the temperature's up to 20 degrees, and now you're complaining that it's too hot. So that's an unfortunate reality that's always going to be with us, as they call them on those shoulder seasons. Both sometimes the spring sometimes gets too hot too fast. Sometimes in the fall it stays too cold, too warm, too long. And of course, we tell people not to open their windows. In fact, it's a provincial law that says we don't want people opening windows on the 16th floor or the 20th floor of a building, because unfortunately children fall out of them sometimes. So we actually have safeguards in place that stop you from opening your window. So a lot of people will say, well, can't you just let me open the window? At least I can get a breeze in. It's actually cooler outside my 16th floor window than it is in my unit. And our response is, no, you can't. because even if you don't have children, we can't go into every unit and inspect every unit to figure out who's allowed to open a window and who's not. So the provincial government and all of us collectively have decided windows should not be opened or only open a very small amount to make sure that children don't fall out of them or and people don't fall out of them and hurt themselves. So I certainly support the report. I'll look forward to how we deal with the public this, and I have to say I tip my hat to our staff and to our executive director. Certainly this is now my 14th year in office, my 8th year on this committee. I'll run again. The evolution of public consultation, I think, has improved dramatically. My preference, and I'll just say it to staff now as they're thinking through their process, I think the working group model is usually more successful than the public consultation model when you get stakeholders from all parts of the spectrum, from the tenants associations, from the landlord associations, from the building owners associations, from the condo people. You get them all together, you let them work together for 6 months or even a year. They come out with pretty good advice. Sometimes having a public meeting where the perception is that the bureaucrats and the politicians have made all the decisions. You come to a meeting, there's some display boards, it looks like everything's done, there's no room for amendment, despite staff saying this is just a draft, and the politicians sitting there saying this is just a draft and we're listening to you. There's more skepticism, and it's more difficult in a 2-hour meeting from 7 to 9 or 7 to 10:30 to have 150 people in a room and the tenants association saying, you know, your public consultation really wasn't adequate. We came into the room, it was a done deal. You had your drafts, you didn't listen to us. You know, all we got was a 5-minute presentation to your staff. So I know even our public consultation meetings are better than that, but I think that's the history of where we came from. So having the working groups where people have had an opportunity one-on-one together, where they actually know the names of our staff, and the tenants associations know the name of the building association owners, so that you build, I think, a better level of trust and understanding, and those people provide very valuable input to our staff. So while we're not voting today on whether we have a working group and who's on it, I hope our staff do that after they do this initial step. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Any other speakers? If not, and Councilor Di Giorgio, please go ahead.
Excuse me, Mr. Chairman, I will make some just very brief comments. First of all, I will support Councilor Nunziata's motion. I do have some reservations simply because, I mean, we can come up with a multitude of initiatives that are luxury items that increase the cost of housing. The moment the provincial government approves something like this, automatically increases the cost of affordable housing. And so there is a conflict between trying to provide affordable housing, keeping costs down. No, I would be amazed if the provincial government passes the thing, but I certainly don't mind requesting. Thank you.
Thank you. So I think we are done with speakers now. We have a recommendation from Councilor Nunziata. Can we have a display, please? All those in favor? Against? On the item as amended, also in favor? Great, fantastic. A couple of things, my friends, before we proceed. First and foremost, welcome back to my Vice Chair, Councilor Karigiannis, and good to have you back. And actually, I'm going to be needing your assistance because at 11:30, I'll be asking you to take the chair, and hopefully you'll be able to speak by then. Thank you. And the other request that I have a request, and a special request from, and I'm going to ask for the indulgence of the committee. We can move item number 4 at this point. At this point, there is only one speaker, and there is some health issues there. So I'm going to move. We can just, with indulgence of the public, if we can just move this item and to deal with it now. It's only one speaker. No. Just there is one speaker to allow the speaker to speak, and then we'll. Great. All those in favor? Against? Thank you. Mr. Patrick James, we are dealing with item number 4, amendments to Chapter 740, Street Vending, Portrait Artists. Please come forward. Good morning, Mr. James. Good to have you here. Thank you for coming. You have 5 minutes. Please go ahead.
So my agenda relates to the artist permits for downtown Toronto. And what I'm trying to do is get the agenda fixed so that through LS 25.4, the current permit system under Chapter 740 gets amended into a format that's similar to a busker permit. Right now, it's a vendor permit, but the situation with that is it's unworkable. So what happened was basically, it's 4 phases. Back in the 1990s, you probably remember all the artists that work downtown by the Eaton Center, and there are around 30 artists or so. And this was a system that didn't have permits at the time. But each year, the artists would operate in the public areas downtown, drawing people's portraits and caricatures. And in the mid-1990s, City Hall intervened to apply the first permit system for the artists so that there would be an official recognition of their presence downtown. So this had some problems because there was large renovation works going on downtown by the Eaton Center. So the first permit system was basically nullified because it was situated by locations, the permits. So it wasn't like a free system where artists could set up anywhere. They had to set up downtown by the Eaton Center. So with the construction activities, I don't know if everybody's listening to this because it's kind of important. If I could have the attention of...
through the chair, please keep speaking. We're paying close attention. Please go ahead.
So what happened with the renovations at the Eaton Center and Yonge and Dundas, the artists were scattered to other areas of Toronto, downtown Toronto. So a new permit system came up. And basically that didn't work as well because the locations where all the other artists were working were not conducive to being profitable. So at that time, I left and went to Montreal. I was in Old Montreal for 14 years, and they had a more rigorous professional system set up there. So I learned how they coordinated with artists to do a proper system that everybody could profit from, the city as well, through permit generations, generated income. So I came back to Toronto in 2015. And what I found was that there was a further new permit system in 2008, and that was worse than ever. So of the original 30 artists who I worked with before 25 years ago, there are only like 5 or 6 left. So at this time, I started to reach out to city staff and the LFC to try and redeem the situation and bring forth a new system so that the artists would come back and everybody would benefit again. So for the past 3 years, I've been struggling to try and get this new permit system adopted so that artists would start coming back and everybody would be happy. So with this now, LS 25.4, what we have here is an amendment. It's like a temporary fix. And it's part of my overall idea, a 2-stage strategy, so that we can go on to a bigger system where potentially artists would bring in around $10,000 a year in generated permit revenue if my idea is successfully put through. So this temporary fix It's simply making the current artist vendor permit into a busker permit. So it would have the advantage of being as cheap as
Thank you, please wrap up.
Okay, so it would have the advantage of being as cheap as the busker permit, bringing back artists, and it would have the flexibility of...
Thank you, Mr. James.
Okay.
Any questions to the deputant? If not, and...
I have a question.
yeah.
Okay, so,
Councilor Luciana, please go ahead.
so why is this a temporary fix? Recommendation, because what it is removing the moratorium
Yeah,
and which allow that permit holders to vend in any area, and also is reducing the permit fees
yeah.
from $468 to $39.
Yeah, so what that will do is, right now, there's no artists left because it was an expensive permit and the current locations assigned for artists, they're unworkable. So what this will do is it's going to remedy that situation. Artists will have the flexibility to work anywhere they want, and they can afford the permit. So they'll start coming back, and this will go towards the bigger next stage, which will be me trying to elevate a system like they have in Montreal. So eventually, we can raise the fees over the next 1 or 2 years up to like $300 or $400, and more artists will come. So it's going to be like $10,000 generated.
Oh, okay. So increasing the fees will encourage more artists.
Yeah, over time.
Yeah,
Once
over
I get
time.
the artists back,
Oh, okay.
and then what I'm going to be doing in this temporary fix is scouting out locations, the best locations for that to happen.
Right.
So this is like a necessary requirement.
Hey, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. Any other questions? If not, thank you, Mr. James, for coming down.
Sure.
And thank you for your tremendous input, and I'll speak to it. Thank you so
Thanks.
much. Questions to staff? Speakers? If not, I'm going to move the recommendations that are before us. First and foremost, I want to thank Mr. Patrick James for bringing something that's very close to his heart to this committee, as well as through him, I was able to bring this to City Council. As you may recall, at the last council meeting, we had a report that was adopted by council, which has given the authority for city staff to bring this report with these recommendations forward to this meeting. And there are a number of good things that are happening within this report, is removing the moratorium, removing the general liability, and for artists like you is to move forward in a way that's equitable in relation to other people. And also you have the opportunity to have additional locations throughout the city of Toronto, so you are not simply told this is your corner and that's at the end of it. But it's very important for us as members of council, as a city council, to correct the wrongs if that's been perceived as a wrong. And I'm very actually glad that I've been taken and I've been given the opportunity to do this. And as you may know, the art overall is very close to my heart. And that's something that I'm very proud of what the City of Toronto has accomplished in terms of embracing the arts community in every sense, and that was through the graffiti management plan that was adopted by City Council. From the brinks of destruction in 2011 to where we are now, we have done wonders, something to be extremely proud. And as chair of this committee, I take a lot of pride and thanks to city staff and for helping out and to bring something new to our arts community. So the recommendations, I think, speaks to it. And for that reason, good luck, my friend. Just go and enjoy and do what's also close to your heart. Thank you so much. And I'm moving the recommendations of the report. Thank you. So we have the recommendations. All those in favor? Against? Carried. Fantastic. So we're moving now to the LS 25.2. That's the review of the fraternities and sorority houses, exemption to Chapter 285 rooming houses. And we have a list of deputants. And we'll start with David Stearns. Good morning. Good to have you here.
Good morning,
Please go
Chair. Good
ahead.
morning, councillors, and thank you for allowing me to present on this. I'm a resident at Lowther and Huron/Madison, so I'm living right where the fraternities live. I live with them. I've seen the good and the bad and the horrible and the dangerous, and I'm here to support the proposal that has been put before you. It's not the proposal that I wanted. It's not the proposal that I think is needed in the end, but it is thankfully a first step towards recognizing what I believe is a pretty significant regulatory gap that exists and that the effects of which I live and my neighbors live with every day. I did write a letter to Mayor Tory in June of last year when this item was first put forward, and I understand it's not before you. I have copies available for people, and also one of my neighbors who is a medical doctor who also wrote a very excellent letter. I have copies of that as well. I'd just like to take you through a few of the points. The situation that exists currently is that the fraternities are not regulated at all. They live in a void. People think that the University of Toronto exercises oversight over fraternities. They do not. They specifically say they are not part of our authority. The Alcohol and Gaming Commission does nothing and has no authority over them, even though they host parties where people pay money to come in and drink unlimited amounts of alcohol. Those parties really are something to see if you've never, thank you, Councillor. Those parties really are quite something to behold. They're advertised to the public, first of all, through social media. There's no security whatsoever. As you know, the drinking age in this province is 19, but the age of admission to university is basically 18. So that's really the crux of the problem. We live up the street from the Madison pub, which is one of the largest pubs in the city, and we really have no complaints about the Madison. They have security. They do what you would expect to keep their license. They serve somebody underage, they go out of business. You just have to go two doors up or 3 doors up to go into a completely anything goes environment. And in my experience and through my observations and through my discussions, it's clear to me that that is an environment that is not safe, starting primarily and ironically with the people who live in those buildings. And then from there, it's not safe for the people who come in en masse at a moment's notice through Ubers that line up all up and down the street. And then it's not safe for the community members. I have gone out. They will say to you, as they say every time this issue comes before this city, it's just a matter of communications. Why don't they talk to us? I'm speaking firsthand. I've lived there for about 12 years, and I have tried and tried and tried. One of the very, very incremental recommendations in this proposal is that they be required to provide contact information. Well, and they're opposed to that. And yet, when we were having consultations, they said, well, of course we'd be happy to provide your contact information. But when it comes to this proposal, my understanding is they're against that. That's really that will be interesting to see when somebody puts their name down as the contact person, as a responsible person in these houses. As I said, I've gone to these houses when the parties are going on. It's a very scary environment. It's very threatening. Some of them are very nice and some of them are very kind, and one-on-one, they'll all admit there's problems. But there's a mentality that takes hold at 2 o'clock in the morning when you can't sleep, and people are up and down the street blocking traffic. And my letter gives a litany of the kind of things that you might expect you would see with this sort of environment. I won't go through all of them, and you can imagine the one easy thing about living near fraternity houses is nobody really doubts that what goes on goes on. I won't take you through the whole list. It is in my letter. Again, I'm here to support the proposal that's before you. It is the most benign, innocuous, minimalist recommendation I think that could be made, short of letting the status quo remain.
Thank you, Mr. Stearns. Would it be possible to have a copy of your submission?
Absolutely.
Thank you so much. Questions to the deputant? Yes, Councillor Joe Cressy, please go ahead.
So just a couple questions of clarification. So first of all, because any time a discussion of fraternities comes up, there's a question of intent. Your position in this is you're not seeking in any way to shut down fraternities, but rather to address the regulatory void and to ensure safety and accountability. Is that right?
That's right.
Okay. Now, you mentioned that this has come before council in the past. So for those who weren't in this chamber, a similar proposal to looking at regulatory changes came forward in 2011, and at the time council chose not to address the regulatory void and instead to encourage communication. Did anything improve following that course of action in 2011?
No, things got worse. In fact, as soon as there was the discussion about regulation stopped, things got worse. There were promises that were made that everything would be fine, you just need to speak to us, we're more than willing to help. That stopped the second there was the talk of regulation ended. I've tried to speak to the Interfraternity Council. It is a secret society. You cannot speak to them. I've tried to ask who is in charge, who's the grown-up in the house. They look at each other and they just don't know. It's just whoever happens to be the most sober on that particular evening. I hate to say it. So no, it actually got worse. And if they say things have gotten better, they have probably gotten better since this committee once again started looking at that. I can't point to an immediate cause and effect. If they come before you and say things have gotten mildly better, it is mildly better, but it is exactly coinciding with what's going on here.
Thank you.
And my fear is if this doesn't pass, we're back 30 years.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yeah, Councilor Nunziata, followed by Councilor DiGiorgio. Please go ahead.
I think Councilor DiGiorgio had his hand up first.
Either one. Madam Speaker, you are
very quickly,
gracious.
Chairman.
Thank you.
Mr. Stearns, is it?
Yes.
You know, my recollection was that we looked at this issue from a planning point of view, planning perspective, back a number of years ago through Planning and Growth Committee. And it is a difficult issue to deal with. So if we go to this committee and we try to regulate, which I'm, supportive of, I'd like to get an idea of how close some of the residential homes are to these sorority houses or fraternities.
Well, we have two within a stone's throw. Two fraternity houses within a stone's throw from our house, and probably 10 within a block.
Okay,
And
so
it's
there are single-family homes interspersed between these fraternities, right?
Very much.
Within, let's say, 50 meters, 100
Very much,
meters?
yes.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Speaker Nunziata.
So you mentioned that there was, from the last time when it came forward, and there was a community consultation, there was dialogue, and then suddenly that just stopped and they
Yes.
just did what they wanted.
There was actually never any community dialogue.
No?
No.
Nothing?
No.
Okay, so what about the landlords? Like, has there ever been any discussion with the landlords?
The houses that we've looked at, and I've had to write to them, we've had to do a corporate search. They're owned by corporations, and the only way to actually get an address is to do a search and see who are the directors. And they're generally speaking former members of the fraternities.
Oh, okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Councilor Burnside, please go ahead.
Thank you. I don't seem to have a copy of your letter. I don't know if anyone does, but what were some of your other recommendations? Maybe the top three beyond.
I'm not, I was supportive of removing the exemption. The exemption, they are, I say perversely exempted from the minimum standards, which are the rooming house standards. And that was what I was hoping I would see, because no one quite knows why that exemption exists. There may have been a time, a long time ago, when, you know, behavior was milder and these were in some ways gentlemen's clubs, and they were actually perhaps the ideal of the civil neighbor. But things have changed dramatically, and yet that exemption still exists.
You really think so? Don't you remember Animal House?
I think the exemption predates Animal House.
Okay, fair enough. Fair enough. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? Thank you, Mr. Stern.
Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation. The next deputant is Sita Ramkalawan Singh. Sita, good to have you here. Welcome back. Good to have you here.
Thank you. I think I've spent the whole week here. Good morning, everybody, and thank you for the opportunity to speak to you. I'm here on behalf of the Grange Community Association. We have 3 or 4 frats in our boundaries, and our boundaries are Spadina to University, Queen to College. But the Annex Residents Association, David is a resident in the Annex, but the Annex Resident Association, they have filed a letter with you, and they've asked me if I would also speak on their behalf. The 5 residence groups which surround the University of Toronto are part of a community liaison committee with the university. It's been meeting informally since the 1970s, but that structure got formalized in 1996 through a bylaw of City Council. We meet regularly 3 or 4 times a year, and I could tell you that in the last 20 years, this comes up frequently. We've raised the issue at the university. The university has written to some of the frat houses, and I agree that there is a need for this kind of student housing, but it needs to be safe, and it cannot interfere with the lives of the people who live around them. I know that some of the frats have said, well, this should be treated like any other residence, but they're not like any other residence. We have people who have minimal attachment to the neighborhood. They're not long-term residents, and really, it sort of a little bit reminds me of what the entertainment district used to be like. Now, I welcome the staff report, and we welcome and support the recommendations that are in the report, and I know that some members of the both associations feel that it should go further, but I think that this is a start. The bulk of the frats are actually in the Annex. Harvard Village and the other residence group and here in Sussex have minimal numbers, if not. But when I looked at the statistics in the staff report, what I see is that there's an average of 32 complaints every year, but you know, the bulk of it relates to waste, noise, property standards, and the 12 have led to orders. But what troubles me the most is when I look at the police statistics in the report, and I see that from January to March of this year, in 3 months alone, there have been 15 complaints filed with the cops. This is an issue of incredible safety for the neighborhoods, for the people who go to these frats, and so on. You'll also see attached to the Annex letter, Annex Residents Association letter, an article from 1985, which speaks to the issue. So there's no dispute that this has been going on from a long time. And you can also see that in the package of letters, there is a letter from the president of the University of Toronto saying, agreeing with the recommendation that there be some form of registration. So committee members, I urge you, for the safety of the people in the neighborhood, for the people who attend parties and so on and so forth, that there be some mechanism for registration and for protecting the neighborhood. So thank you, that's all I have to say. Under 5 minutes.
Thank you, Sira. Is questions? And Councilor Cressy, you're the first one.
Just very briefly, so you mentioned that there are 5 local residents associations who support these recommendations. Is it also the case that the local student associations of the University of Toronto support these, the undergrad and graduate associations?
My recollection is from discussions at the liaison committee meetings, so there have been verbal support for the need to protect students.
And you mentioned in your remarks, the University of Toronto, President Merritt Gertler, on behalf of the university, is supportive of these recommendations formally, correct?
Yes, he is, and there's a letter dated May 2nd, which is in your package, and he says he wants to express the University of Toronto's support for creating reporting requirements for fraternity and sorority houses as a requisite for qualifying for the exemption. So if they don't register, why would they qualify? Because, you know, we got lots of other problems as rooming houses, so at a minimum, registration.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions?
It's not often the University of Toronto
DiGiorgio.
writes these letters. so-
Sita. Councilor DiGiorgio, please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Sita, can I assume that in fact, any efforts made to deal with these houses as a nuisance or as safety issues, that municipal licensing was not very effective in coming in and dealing with the noise factor, public health was not maybe not very effective in coming in and dealing with the safety issues? Is that a reasonable assumption?
That, I think, is a reasonable assumption, and that's what's been reported to me.
Thank you.
So, thank you.
Any other questions? Sita, thank you so much.
Thank you very
Good
much.
to have you here.
Good to
Thank
see
you.
everybody.
The next deputant is Jeb Wall, followed by Kevin Tato. Jeb Ball.
Excuse me, I've got a little bit of a hearing issue, so.
Take your time.
Mr. Chair, thanks for the.
Good morning. Good to have you here.
Speak briefly.
Please go ahead. You have 5 minutes. Please go ahead.
Yes, I'll be much shorter than that, and I am sorry, this ear is not working today, so my apologies there. Mr. Carson, I believe, is on your list as a speaker down the road. Is that correct? Good.
We do have Mr. Carson as well.
He'll be carrying the brunt of our argument. I am a representative of the corporation that owns 180 St. George, the corner of St. George and Prince Arthur, and have been a member there since 1976. I think the main issue for residents, certainly that we hear, is noise and property standards, and we certainly agree these are issues that we continually struggle to address. The issue of building or tenant safety, which fraternities are compelled to address in great detail and comprehensiveness by our insurers and central offices, is, I believe, a red herring. The safety at the large parties, which we, certainly in our fraternity, we have attempted to restrict considerably, is again a struggle that we continue to work with. I think the exemption of fraternities from designation as rooming houses was confirmed by staff in 2011 in joint consultation with zoning, planning, Toronto Police, and the Fire Department. It was confirmed that our living arrangements do not conform to the definition of rooming house in the old bylaw or in the new one. I'm at a loss to see what has changed since then. The complaint list that I saw does not appear to have gone so skyrocketingly high over the last some years. As a matter of fact, in many cases has dropped to warrant some review of this issue by staff with a view to those complaints. Staff reviewed it on the basis of the living arrangements that we have. We are more of a, I would say, a commune in each of our houses than we are a rooming house. Mr. Carson will talk later a bit about this, I suppose. At the very least, I would hope this matter be referred back to staff for a further more detailed review, because I think some issues have been glossed over in in the rush to bring it, what I think is a kind of a heavy-handed approach to regulating how our buildings are to be operated. Most of us have been there for 50 years, and in some cases, on campus or near campus for over 100. At best, I would hope this suggestion be dismissed altogether as a misguided attempt to deal with noise and behavior issues, which we do acknowledge need our constant attention, and of bylaw enforcement officers and of Toronto Police. As I say, Mr. Carson will take his full 5 minutes. I will confirm to you, and he has put forward a letter which addresses these matters in detail. I didn't realize I'd be going first. Thank you, Mr. Chair, Mr. Vice Chair.
Visiting Councillor. Thank you, Chris.
Well, thank you for being here. So I heard you say that you believe the staff recommendations are heavy-handed. Could you tell me what is heavy-handed about requiring organizations with an exemption to provide contact information to the city?
I will say I personally have no problem with that.
Okay,
I think every one of our chapters on campus or near campus, there should be a name, and I believe that was a recommendation in 2011, and I'm not sure why that was not enforced.
So, but the staff recommendation is to provide that reporting. That is the staff recommendation. So why are you not supportive of that and asking for us to refer this back?
My issue is with the rooming house matter.
So,
not with the contact information. That could be part of the review, but my view is that staff should be more comprehensive in their review of existing jurisprudence and bylaws and so forth on the rooming house matter only.
But the request for the exemption, the removal of the exemption is not the staff recommendation. So why are you not supportive of the recommendations? Why are they heavy-handed if you just said you're supportive of them?
I guess I'm saying that I'm looking forward to after the period, I believe the exemption is, or rather the suggestion is, again, may I leave this to Mr. Carson? I think he's reviewed this in more detail.
Well, with all due respect, sir, you just came and said that this is a heavy-handed approach and that this matter should not be dealt with here today.
The rooming house, only the rooming house issue, Council.
But you just told me you're supportive of the actual staff recommendations, which we're discussing.
Yes, I suppose.
Okay, sir, I'm sorry, it's not your turn to speak. Yeah. Thank you very much. That's all my question.
Okay, I'll leave it to Mr. Carson to explain a little more clearly, but it's the rooming house issue going down the road that's my problem.
Burnside.
Thank you. Through you, in your deputation, you've said you acknowledge that certain things need attention. I think you're talking about garbage or whatever you're talking about, right?
Yeah. As every house needs attention to its property standards,
Okay, that's fine. So
private.
Okay, so what have you done to address that?
I am here just as an interested alum who is not involved in the organization of the fraternity anymore.
But so, do you understand our sort of dilemma? And I went to university, love frat houses, love the parties. Don't get me wrong. All that said, when somebody comes and says, "Hey, yeah, we need," we acknowledge things need attention, and then seemingly done nothing about it, or doing the, "Hey, look over there," it's very difficult.
I can see that some residents could cherry pick some difficulties that we've encountered over the years. Each year is different. Each year's management is different. Each year's board, it doesn't change quite so quickly. And I think issues are addressed as they arise. We have, in many cases, very nice old buildings which are kind of money pits, and we attempt to make sure that the property standards are kept and so forth. And certainly in our house, we try to minimize the number of parties and sort of public affairs, as it were, because of the wear and tear on the building.
So, again, I'll just leave you with this one. Would you acknowledge, okay, so you actually just said they're money pits, they're old, they need a lot of work. And I don't know if they're 10, 20, 30, I don't know how many people live in, because every house is different, right? Mm-hmm. But would you, given the age of these buildings and the rundown condition, certainly on the interior, would you not acknowledge that maybe there are like fire hazards and all these things?
I would say that we are probably as regulated as any of the housing stock in Toronto community housing or the campus co-ops and all that sort of thing. We have sprinkler systems, we have fire safety plans. Our insurers inspect us every year to make sure that these...
Right, but would you not acknowledge that where you have certainly a number of people living in a confined space, that the city has an obligation to do everything that it can to ensure the resident safety?
I think we handle it well enough on our own, Councillor.
Okay, thanks.
So, first year, the answer to Councillor Cressy's question that you do support the name, giving the contact information, then on the other hand, you're asking for deferral. And since this report has come through council, since 2013 to 2018, the issues from the community have escalated. So why is it that you have done absolutely nothing to address the community concerns? And then you just want us to defer this?
Yeah. I'm afraid I'm not the person to ask that question, sir. Madam, I believe maybe I'm somewhat unqualified to be here today.
Well, then you shouldn't be here speaking if you're not qualified.
I agree, I shouldn't.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate it. Thank you very much. Any other questions of the deputy? Thank you very much, sir. Next person to speak would be Adam Carson.
Hello, good morning. My name is Adam Carson. I'm the chair of the alumni board for Beta Theta Pi Fraternity, and I speak for the majority of the fraternity and sorority houses located north of the University of Toronto. I'm here today to request that the staff report not be accepted and that the recommendations brought forward within it not be accepted. The reasoning for that is that it's my belief that during the harmonization of the zoning bylaw for the City of Toronto, that extensive research by both planning, licensing, and legal was conducted to ascertain the status and the designation for our properties. At that time, the determination was made that our properties were neither businesses nor rooming houses subject to licensing under Chapter 285 of the Municipal Code. It's my understanding from information brought to me by staff that this report was brought forward without consulting with the planning department or with any considerable investigation with the Toronto Police Service. I'd like to address the original motion that was brought forward that called for this report and point out the fact that the majority of the content of the recommendations don't fall under what was requested. The first part of the original motion requested licensing. That licensing question has been asked and answered by not only this committee, but by council and planning and licensing staff in 2011. Nothing material has changed with the nature of our organizations or the manner in which these properties are organized and operate. It was also found that these properties operate as single housekeeping units within a dwelling. Also, not subject to licensing under Chapter 285. The recommendation Part 1A and B is tantamount to licensing. The registration of the organization and the registration of individual members with the city is no different than subjecting someone to licensing. It's my understanding that the city is not afforded the authority by the Planning Act or the Building Code to license individuals or organizations dependent on their association. With the question regard to where this exemption was brought forward from and the nature by which the city intended it to be used, we have to go back to 1983. In 1983, 744-83 was brought forward as an amendment to 502, the rooming house bylaw. This amendment was brought forward for the sole purpose of defining what cooperative student housing, fraternity, and sorority houses were, because it couldn't be defined in the Zoning Act because they are undefined terms only recognizable by the individuals or the association. The reason that this bylaw was brought forward was so that the city could define exactly what not-for-profit student housing was. They went so far as to add a Part C, and that's included in the detailed documentation that I provided to you via email, that they included a notwithstanding clause that clearly stipulated that fraternity, sorority houses and cooperative student housing are not rooming houses. Now, when 502 was consolidated and brought forward as Chapter 285 of the Municipal Code, the notwithstanding clause, as it was with almost every bylaw in the City of Toronto at the time, was converted to the form of an exemption because of the legal issues surrounding notwithstanding clause. The city's intent and belief from the very beginning always stipulated that our properties were not rooming houses and should not be subject to licensing. The only reason that this exemption and the reference to fraternity houses and sorority houses and cooperative student housing exists in the Rooming House Act was so to define what we are, so that the city had the capability to weed out nefarious for-profit entities wishing to masquerade as not-for-profit student housing. So in a nutshell, that's the legal side of it. Planning has determined that we are no different than any other house in the City of Toronto. The Planning Act and the Courts Superior and Appeal have both determined that the nature in which our organizations utilize our properties, which, by the way, are owned by the individuals living within the house and the members of the fraternity, are seen as a single housekeeping unit. I'd like to also address the issues of safety that have been brought up by members of the public, the councillor, and a number of other people. I would like it to be known that we carry on a regular and extensive line of communication with
10 seconds, wrap it up.
by law enforcement, Toronto Police Service. We speak with them quite regularly. I wanted to speak to the nature of the data provided, and that it should be taken. It should not be taken as being a full representation of the reality.
All right,
because the
thank you,
Toronto
sir.
Police Service. This is a very important point.
Thank you, sir.
Okay.
Any questions? Visiting Councillor Cressy.
Well, thank you for being here. You mentioned at the beginning that you speak for a majority of houses. Could you please name and identify the houses which you're speaking for here today?
No.
Excuse me. Mr. Chair, I'm sorry. So could I just repeat? You said that you speak for a majority. You are here speaking today on behalf of a...
I don't have an itemized...
If I could finish my question, please. You mentioned that you are here speaking for a majority of fraternity houses and sororities. Could you please identify who you are speaking on behalf of?
I don't have an itemized list of associations and addresses at my disposal to list off to you right now. If I was to provide any names, it could be in error or incomplete.
But who are you speaking on behalf of? Who are you here today speaking for?
Well, this is the question that you and I had 3 years ago that entered into this situation where you and I and all of the fraternity and sorority houses couldn't enter into a community dialogue because you refused to engage with us.
Excuse me, could you please, you'll forgive me, I'm not trying to be combative. But you mentioned that you're speaking here today representing a majority of fraternities. I'm simply asking you to tell me which fraternities you're speaking on behalf of. I'm not asking for an address, I'm just asking, who are you here speaking for?
The fraternities and sorority property owners.
So there are 19 fraternities and sororities that the city is aware of. Which of those 19 are you speaking on behalf of?
All of them.
Sorry, you're speaking on behalf of all 19 fraternities and sororities?
Through our group discussions with regard to this matter, I have been designated to speak on their behalf with regard to issues of licensing, safety, and community interaction.
So, sorry, just to clarify, all 19 fraternities and sororities in the City of Toronto, you are here speaking on behalf of them, every one of them?
Sure.
Sure?
If you want to make this into some kind of
No, I just
deposition
want-
where
so-
you're
no,
or
that's fine.
deputing
Councilor Cressy,
relevant-
I think that he answered that question.
Okay, so
Okay, thank you.
how many, okay, so you're speaking on behalf of 19 fraternities and sororities. How many residents live in those 19 fraternities and sororities you're speaking on behalf of?
I don't have an exact count of the number of residents living within the houses. It wasn't a component of the report and unnecessary to have.
But just, I'm sorry, we're trying to address the health and safety of the residents of 19 houses that you are
And I
speaking on behalf of.
I would be more than willing to discuss
you could-
safety issues with you.
So if I could finish my sentence. You're speaking on behalf of 19 houses. How many people live in those 19 houses?
I don't have that number offhand.
How many people work in those 19 houses?
Nobody works in those houses.
Okay. Is there contact information available for each house so that if a member of the community or as a local councillor or the city wishes to have a conversation, is there contact information publicly available for each of those 19 houses?
Councillor Cressy, you have contact information to reach every single one of those property owners. All of that information is provided with the city tax roll. Anyone...
Mr. Carson, please try to respond to the questions. Questions are very specific.
Yes.
And
Yes.
if you don't have that information, that's fine.
No,
We
yes,
understand
yes,
that.
the information is available.
Through the tax rolls?
It's available through the tax rolls. The Toronto Police Service has our contact information. Bylaw enforcement has our
Sorry,
contact
just-
information.
I've spoken with Toronto Police Services and by law enforcement, and the recommendation here is to require contact information for each of those because we don't have it at the city. So can you, as the representative for these 19 houses, provide this committee with contact information for each of those houses?
The contact information as requested in the staff report is no different than licensing, which is specifically exempted.
So-
Now, as a
Sorry,
community,
if I
as a
could
community
just-
service, that information is already available to the parties that require it.
But
As
just-
private organizations and private citizens, we're not required to publicly,
So thank you.
publicly publish that
But
information.
if I could just be clear, you are here representing 19 houses, but you can't identify them, and you can't tell me how many people live in them. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Any other questions? Is Councillor Bernstein followed by Councillor DiGiorgio? Please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Through you, you said I think I caught at the end there, you said you're not required to publish the information of contacts?
As a private organization, we're not required to publish our membership rolls and our phone.
Oh, just membership, not the contact of the property. Are you okay with the I'm really confused here, right?
The issue that we have here is that we're
Hold on for a sec, hold on. Sorry. I can't hear.
We can have just a little bit of...
Sorry about that.
The issue that we have here is that the requirements put forward in the report to modify the zoning or the rooming house bylaw is no different than licensing. Licensing requires registration of individuals and what have you. That is specifically what this is asking for. The exemption specifically excludes us from that because, as I had explained earlier, the city has already long since determined that these properties are not rooming houses and should not be subject to licensing. This definition and the existence of the exemption is only there to give the city the ability to weed out and determine non-parties.
You understand the beauty of laws, though, right? They can be changed.
No, I completely understand the beauty of laws. But the issue here is that the courts and the Planning Act stipulates what a single housekeeping unit is. And a single housekeeping unit doesn't fall under the purview of the Rooming House Act.
Okay, so as I say, I don't live anywhere near there. I don't represent anyone near you, so I got no skin in the game,
I
as it
completely
were.
understand that.
But all that being said, quite often, at least from my short experience here, a lot of organizations voluntarily enter into things, right? And kind of a cooperative effort. I know the previous gentleman said that actions have been taken, and he said maybe you could supply some of the actions. But would it not sort of be in your interest to work with the
Oh, I
city?
absolutely think that it'd be in our interest to work. In fact, shortly after Councillor Cressy was elected, we reached out and tried to set up a working group, but Councillor Cressy, as he has today, took on a combative attitude.
Okay, so
Contested the
Carson,
fact that we were not.
Mr. Carson, excuse me, that's totally inappropriate,
Sorry.
and I will ask you to refrain and actually to apologize.
Okay, yes,
to those
yes, we
comments.
have, and we have offered to meet at the discretion of the councillor. No such meeting was ever organized.
okay, so in terms of my issue is the fire and all the
Yeah,
safety.
and I can speak to that.
Not the parties. I mean, we've probably all been to those, but
I can speak to any issue of
But okay, yeah, that's cool. But I know that you said that you have meetings with MLS and everything else.
Mm-hmm.
But are all 19? Because I know I'm a little bit confused of the back and
So
forth.
the way the-
but have all 19 sororities and fraternities undergone all the various fire? Just
Yes.
let's start with the fire.
Yes, their international organizations mandate it, and they also mandate us to carry insurance policies that need to be certified every single year. Those policies mandate the property to be certified as safe and to contain substantial fire and safety infrastructure.
Okay.
And I might say that on the topic of fire and safety, you have a representative of the fire service here. It would be in the interest of this committee to ask him whether or not the Toronto Fire Services believe that any of our properties are of concern to them.
Okay, and I guess I just have another question here. So ultimately, the ultimate question is, even if the city were somehow to go down the road of putting you in that regulatory framework for rooming houses, let's say, or create something special, I don't know. What's the opposition? What's the problem? I don't get it.
The opposition is that there's always a threat associated with it. If you read to the finality of the report, basically what they're saying is, and without defining the rationale for it, if this registration is for one reason or another rejected by MLS, then we would be subject to the full brunt of the licensing of rooming houses, which the city has already clearly stipulated on a number of occasions through bylaws and the findings of both planning and licensing that we're clearly not.
Yeah, I know, I get that,
was the
but
last question.
I know that, but hold on.
So
Sorry,
we
last thing.
so we have absolutely no problem at all setting up a framework by which the city can engage with the various property owners. As it stands right now, the Toronto Police Service contacts me with any issue they have, and I immediately relay that information to the appropriate property owner. The same occurs with bylaw enforcement, and the same can also occur with our local councillor. This is what occurred with Councillor Vaughn after the report was brought back in 2011. His staff admin would call, I would relay the information, problem would be immediately addressed. Safety issues within these houses.
Okay, that's fine. I mean, you didn't really answer my question, and I think other
Well, the base
other
question
people
is
would
that
say
we-
that
we
maybe
have
the
serious-
issues
we have
haven't been
serious
addressed,
issues.
but I'll leave it
Thank
at
you,
that.
Councilor Burnside. Councilor DeGiorgio, you're next.
Mr. Chairman. So, Mr. Carson, your position, as I understand it, you started out basically saying that the new zoning bylaw established that the fraternity use was a permitted use in those areas that we're talking about.
Yep.
And that automatically gave you an implicit license to...
No. No, I didn't stipulate that.
No, you didn't say that, but what I'm saying is when you have the zoning in place, typically one qualifies for a license to do whatever they do within their homes. I mean, we don't need a license to have a party in our homes.
No, of course not.
A single-family home. In the same way, you won't need a license to have a party in a fraternity.
No.
But implicit in that is that the right to have a party is a privilege.
Yeah.
And it's a privilege that would you agree with me that it's a privilege because you're basically abiding by certain standards, related to noise, related to what I would call property standards?
Absolutely, and I would agree with that.
Okay, you would agree with that. Would you also agree that, well, it's a privilege, not a right?
I don't know that I agree with that. I think that that this country avails us the right to do a number of things as long as there is ample proof that you're not doing it with malice.
All right, so you're taking issue with when staff says, you know, you've got to, I'll say you got to register and you got to have a person designated that that people in the community can contact, that is something that you don't believe you should need to do because you have a right not to do that.
No, that's not exactly what I said. What I believe is that when you start legislating the licensing of individuals or groups based on their chosen association, it enters into a very dangerous area. We have no issue with providing contact information to parties that require it, as the by law enforcement, police service, fire can have it. The counselor can even have the information.
That's all the recommendations asks.
No, what the recommendation is requiring the registration and codification of us in order to qualify for an exemption that we already are entitled to.
I agree you're entitled to an exemption, but...
And in actuality, when looking at the evolution of the exemption itself, the exemption wasn't a privilege that was bestowed upon cooperative student housing fraternities and sororities. It was a tool utilized by the city in order to differentiate between for-profit housing operations and not-for-profit student groups.
So can you just direct me to the recommendations and direct me to the phrase or whatever wording that you're objecting to?
So we object specifically to all of
Section 1. Tell me of all the recommendations.
All
of
Section 1.
You have a problem with number 3?
Pardon me?
Do you have a problem with 3?
3 is... Yes, because
conduct research.
The issue with
consultation.
The issue with 3 is that, in our opinion, 3 has been asked and answered with the June 14, 2011 report that was compiled by Planning, Licensing, and Legal during the harmonization of the zoning bylaw. All questions related to licensing as businesses or Chapter 285 were fully answered and vetted.
But you are aware that over time we sometimes do official plan amendments that
yes. But the Planning Act still oversees that.
Pardon me?
The Planning Act still oversees that.
Correct.
And the Planning Act stipulates that you cannot
we can do official plan
pass a
amendments
bylaw.
at any time.
Correct. You cannot pass a bylaw based on individuals or groups regardless of their relation.
All right, so you have a problem with number 3. Number 2, do you have a problem with 2?
Well, number 2, the issue I have, number 2, speaks to cooperative student housing, which I'm not here to speak on behalf of, but I would take the position that this is a question for planning and zoning to determine and not licensing when you're looking at the terminology and its definition.
And if planning decides that you have to abide by certain regulations, or what I call performance standards, you have no problem with that?
Define a performance standard.
Okay.
Define a performance standard.
Standard is, does the building comply with all the regulations? For example, is it in conformity with the regulations? Like if the regulations say you've got to be 6 feet away from your neighbor, you might be only 4 feet or something like that.
Well, we're already subject to the building code, and whenever any renovations are done to our homes, they're subject to the same review at the completion of the project.
Do you ever do an addition to the sorority, to the fraternity?
Generally, they're not additions. Generally, additions are not done to these properties. What takes place is either safety infrastructure is implemented or there are refurbishments. Plaster and lath drywall is replaced with drywall, things of that nature, plumbing upgrades, safety with electricity.
That was your last question. Any other questions? Councilor Ciara.
So just one question. So you're against licensing?
Very much so. We feel that we're fully obligated to the current bylaw, and we do everything that we can to substantiate it. If you take a look at the data that was provided in the report and then speak with bylaw enforcement or refer to the report from 11, the data that's provided, giving these humongous numbers, aren't substantiated.
But why would you be against that?
Why would I be against the licensing?
Yes.
Because
we license a number of establishments.
Because the licensing framework that will be brought forward here, and we believe that the end result will be the attempt to invoke that licensing in a punitive measure in order to remove our properties and our students from the area. And the very report that we're looking at right now, even as benign as people might think that the registration of the contact person is, it stipulates without any reasoning that if the city so chooses to reject that registration, that the property will be immediately classified as a rooming house and subject to penalties for running as such without a license, which directly contravenes the exemption that we're talking about here in the first place.
Thank you. Any other questions? Thank you, Mr. Carson.
You're welcome.
The next deputant is Kevin Tattle. Sorry, you were supposed to be called before Mr. Carson.
Oh, thank you.
Please go ahead. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you to the committee chair and the committee for hearing me today. My name is Kevin Tuttle, and I'm a volunteer alumni board member of the Housing Corporation that owns 163 St. George Street. I lived there as an undergraduate fraternity member in the mid to late 1980s, and I've been a member for almost 34 years. My colleagues from the other alumni boards are speaking about the issue of property standards and noise, so I'd like to focus attention briefly on the comments from LS 25.2, section dated 26 April 2018 about Toronto Police Service data from January 2014 to March 2018. The section raises more questions than it answers, but let me state unequivocally from the start that all of the men's and women's fraternities and sororities have a zero tolerance policy for criminal activity of any kind, and especially assault or sexual assault. Our national offices have training on these issues, and our codes of conduct require our student members not only to refrain from criminal activity, which is patently obvious, but also to do the honorable thing and cooperate with police as witnesses in the defense of victims. The number of incidents reported in LS 25.2 states that police were responding to incidents which were, quote, at or near 14 of the 19 fraternity and sorority houses, end quote. It does not state if any of the suspects were members or their guests, nor does it state if any of the incidents led to charges. In fact, in the 47% of cases of theft under $5,000 and 15% of cases being theft of a motor vehicle under $5,000, it is known to me personally that many of the victims were residents of our houses and that we called the police, and that the alleged criminals were from outside of our community. The remaining 18% relate to various types of assault. The Toronto Police Service say themselves in the report that, quote, it should be noted that occurrences could be in response to a request by a resident at the fraternity or sorority house, and that occurrences are marked with the nearest address, but do not necessarily confirm an incident at that specific address, end quote. In fact, I have not heard of a single incident since I came on the board in 2009 where any fraternity or sorority members were charged in an alleged incident of any kind, let alone actually convicted. We feel we're being unfairly singled out for acts which trouble all of society at large and are of particular concern on university campuses across Canada and the United States. Acts which we are vigilant against inside our own organizations in order to be the very best contributors to our community that we can be. We would be more interested in data that distinguishes between 4 things. 1, incidents or calls for service, when people call 911 and the police show up at the curb. 2, arrests. 3, actual charges. And 4, convictions. And also be interested in data in a report like this that illustrates if any of our members or their guests are the suspects or the victims. In a letter to Mayor Tory last year, which is now part of the public record, one of our neighbors tells a story of where he heard a young woman cry rape outside of a fraternity party. To all of our neighbors, do not be like this and fail to call 911. have the courage to step up and help. I don't know if he was merely a victim of the well-known bystander effect or if he made up this incident. There's no evidence that we know of that this occurred, and we are open to being corrected. We simply feel that adequate criminal laws exist that currently apply to all residents of the City of Toronto, and we firmly believe in having these laws applied equally. This brings me to my final point. While we cooperate with each other to address those classic bylaw enforcement issues around garbage and noise and the like, let us not casually toss in disparaging, uncorroborated remarks about the very serious issue of sexual assault. We find it irresponsible and defamatory when sweeping general statements are made about our organizations on this topic, which are then repeated by the media and even by our own city councillor, and ends up in the meetings of city records. We recommit ourselves to preventing sexual assault in our student community and pledge to be easy to work with on this issue. We ask that our city councillor, our colleagues at the residents' associations, and our individual neighbors work with us cooperatively on this serious matter. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I just want to remind deputants that please refrain from using any offensive, disrespectful, or unparliamentary language as it refers to members of council or city officials or members of the public as well. That's my job as chair of the committee to maintain that sense of decorum and civility. Thank you. Questions to the deputant and Speaker Nuciana. Go
Yes,
ahead.
just a question. So you made a comment about doubting the neighbor on his comments, but in the report, Toronto Police Services has commented on the number of motor vehicle thefts, sexual assault, and other incidents that happened. So are you doubting the police services report as well, that you don't believe they're telling the truth?
No, ma'am, I think these numbers are absolutely correct. I don't doubt that in the least. These are incidents, and I'd be interested to what, my understanding is an incident is a call to service and not necessarily.
No, they're reporting the percentage, so they're not calls. Thank you.
Councillor Cressy.
Sorry, forgive me, are you saying that the police incident reports are not accurate?
I'm saying that we don't understand what the details of the incidents are. As it says in the report, respectfully, Mr. Chair, that the addresses don't necessarily match to where the incident actually took place. And it doesn't distinguish between whether our members or our guests were the victims and called the police to the scene for some incident.
So, I mean, forgive me because it is very serious matters. Does it concern you that the police are reporting incidents of this nature and at this many and of this frequency over a 5-year period? Does that concern you, that the police are giving us that information?
I'm deeply concerned about safety in the annex, and our members who are students at the University of Toronto who traverse the annex need to live in a safe community as well, and I take it deeply seriously, sir.
Thank you. Any other questions? Councillor Giorgio, please go ahead.
Let me, I'm interested in the comment you made with respect to neighbors working cooperatively with Fraternity. So if I'm a neighbor and I'm continually kept awake by noise and whatnot, loud music that goes on, how do I communicate with you, and then what are you able to do for me?
That's a very good question, Councillor. Thank you, Mr. Chair, through the chair. I can speak specifically to our property, for example. To the south of us, we have a large apartment building, about 8 stories, and we have a direct line of communication with the property manager. And every September, we invite him to our corporation board meeting to speak to our student members about the importance of being good neighbors. Directly behind us, we have 2 single-family homes. One's occupied by former Governor General Adrienne Clarkson and her husband, John Ralston Saul, with whom we have an open dialogue. They have my cell number personally, as does the other neighbor, private neighbor to the side. I'm sure the RCMP has my cell number now as well, in fact.
And then to
point is-
the north of us is another fraternity, and of course, we collaborate
My
closely with them.
point is, I'm thinking of fraternities that are just in the neighborhood of single-family homes. I'm not looking at high-rise 12-story buildings.
Yeah, those are all of our
What I want
neighbors
to
and
know
our
is,
properties.
what I want to know is, what are you able to do for a person who has difficulty sleeping because of all the noise? Do you basically say to him, maybe you should take sleeping pills?
Oh, no. I think every property owner has a responsibility to respect their neighbors, and a neighbor can,
the end of the day, it's
where I live, I'd either knock on the door or I would call the police.
At the end of the day, it's about respecting neighbors.
Yes, sir.
And so if we somehow implement some guidelines for what we call respecting neighbors, what difficulty would you have in meeting those guidelines?
Well, as it relates to this report on hand, it leads to licensing as a rooming house, which is a non-starter.
Forget about what it leads to. What I'm saying is, if we put in guidelines, do you have any problem complying with the guidelines?
I believe it doesn't need to be a guideline. I think we already do have open and good communication with all of our neighbors at my property. Yes, sir.
All right, thank you.
Any other questions? If not, thank you, Mr. Tato.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, everyone.
We move on to James McCreet, followed by Randall Penser. Two more.
Hello, committee members, and thank you for giving me a few minutes to chat. My name's Jim McCreath. I'm a 50-year member of Zeta Psi Fraternity at 180 St. George Street. I don't speak for anyone other than myself, and perhaps my fraternity and my experiences, 50 years of... I lived Animal House. I was there. I started in the fall of 1967. That was me. I saw it all. I did it all. I'd like to think that things have changed a little bit. I think they have. Mr. Stern and I have exchanged business cards. What I see here is happening is perhaps we need a little better communication between the fraternities and the community. A lot of the things you're requesting, I don't see why there would be a problem. I can't speak for the International or Fraternity Council, but I would like to think that they would be very open to you folks and give you exactly what you want. I mean, a lot of what you're asking for is just common sense, okay? And this is what I feel that we should work with you and Mr. Stern and carry this through. I'm not here to talk about licensing. I guess that's what it all comes down to. But I just think a common sense dialogue a little further that we could meet together and find out what exactly is best for all of us. My concern with the university community and what I'm very involved is the mental health of students, okay? When I joined in '67, my wife died, or my mother died at the end of first year. It was my brothers that got me through it. Later on, my wife took her own life through anxiety, depression. I've worked with the Bell Let's Talk as a facilitator to talk to people about mental health. Suicide at universities, anxiety, depression, it's an epidemic. What fraternities are, is an oasis, a sanctuary for a small group of people to get together and have a peer group that might save their lives, okay? It's almost a unique thing in University of Toronto, overwhelming. Our chancellor at University of Toronto, the Honourable Michael Wilson, is also the chairman of the Canadian Mental Health Committee. His son took his own life in university. This is what I'd like to work with. You know, we have a purpose. We have some good that we do here as a group, okay? So all I want to say is if we could continue the dialogue, reach out to each other. I will work with Mr. Stern as an individual. I'm not the chairman of anything other than I will say our housing committee, which I chair, we just spent $10,000 to get an engineer's report to do what we have to do to fix it up to standard. We're at code right now. But the problem is that there's 19 different units here, 19 different groups of people. That's why it's very difficult to say, for anyone to say, I represent everybody. But if there is this council, I don't see why they can't give you certainly the contact information you need. What I'm saying is basically there's room for further discussion, okay? I think by and large we're willing to work with you folks. I don't know why we wouldn't. It makes common sense. We all want the right thing. I mean, you know, I have 3 daughters, 2 granddaughters. Sexual assault is very high on my list, and alcohol abuse. None of us wants any trouble, okay? We want to work together with you and come to a sensible conclusion that we've been there for 100 years. I don't think we're going away. We just want to make things better. That's all I have to say, okay? Okay.
Thank you. Questions, Councilor Cressy, please go ahead.
Very quickly, and thank you so much for being here. So in that effort of working together to address potential concerns and safety issues, are you supportive of the recommendations here that would require the 19 fraternities to provide contact information?
Absolutely. I don't personally, okay? I just, why not? I mean, and for the communities, I mean, we have to work with people. I mean, the last thing I'm going to say is I live about a mile away from where that tragic accident had the van on Yonge Street, okay? And I saw Mayor Tory talk in his first press conference, and this is what he said about the people of Toronto. We were admired around the world for being inclusive, accepting, understanding, and considerate. And that's what I would like to see in this room. And that's what, you know, we are. Torontonians are like that. And I think we can be like that. I think we can work together to get everybody what they want. And it doesn't have to be onerous. It's just communication is the key to understanding. So if we can do that, and I will contact Mr. Stern and whoever wants to. Okay? All right, thank you.
Thank you. Can I have Mr. Randall Panvier?
Pat, sir.
All right, sir. You got 5 minutes.
My suggestion is that if someone calls the police to say that there is a noise complaint, that the police officer can issue a ticket immediately if they agree that there has been an offense committed. A $20 fine, and that every time that the offensive party has committed another offense, a police officer can double that fine. This is much better than having residents having to keep records for months on end, or maybe even years on end, of offending parties as far as noise infractions. I think the police, as far as a speeding ticket, they automatically issue a ticket. And they should be allowed to do the same thing as far as noise infractions. I think a $20 ticket at the first infraction, double it every time the police have records of some offending party. They can look on their computers to see how many times has this residence committed this offense. And every time the offense is committed, double the ticket every time. The police should be able to have that power to do that. That is something that I think might help as far as making the neighborhoods more livable. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions of the deputant? Thank you, sir. Next deputant is Christian Chan.
Good morning, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. My name is Christian Chan. I am a resident of the Annex. Also, I am a former director of the Annex Residents Association. I am also a former chair and member of the Committee of Adjustment, Toronto and East York, and also a practicing land use planner. My submissions to you today is more of a technical nature related to the recommendations. I believe in their current form, I wouldn't be supportive of them. However, I do have some suggestions. I've submitted to them in the report that I have sent to the committee clerk 2 days ago, dated May 2nd, and my recommendations are stated on page 5 of that report. They are related to amendments to the conditions or the recommendations, one being omit the requirement of at least 3 students confirmed as member of a sorority or fraternity, as I don't believe this is enforceable and contrary to Section 2D of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms with regards to association to groups. Secondly, omit the requirement of a certification of existing fraternity sorority houses as they've existed for a very long time in their current locations, and I believe it's wasteful of resources and time as these organizations and houses already publicly identify as such with the letters on their houses if you pass by, and they've existed there for decades.
I do believe that certification is required, but only for new fraternity and sorority houses, so as to make it clear to the city that they are not operating as rooming houses nor are subject to licensing fees and inspections as a result, and also to deter future or current property owners who may hold themselves as falsely using their houses as fraternity and sorority houses. Another amendment would be to have a reference as a organization as a local, national, or international student fraternity, so as not to prejudice the local fraternities that exist or may exist in the future. And the local fraternities and sorority is an organization that's defined as a organization that just has a one chapter locally. They're not affiliated to a national and international, and can't provide that certification. And for recommendation B, I believe that it is overreaching to require that the contact information for the national and internationals be provided, especially with respect to the larger fraternal organizations that are based out of the United States. As I understand, they are quite large and administrative organizations that probably have staffing that is comparable to the City of Toronto itself, and it would be a long time before you would get an answer from them. And therefore, I recommend that the recommendation be amended that the contact person shall be the owners of the property, their agents, and their staff, so they can be better able to respond to the more immediate concerns of neighboring residents and municipal staff. And I would like to note also that fraternity and sorority houses are materially different from rooming houses, as I've outlined in the first section of my report. Our buildings they permit students to live affordably in one of the most expensive downtown residential neighborhoods in Canada, if not the world. They form part of the significant part of the annex's affordable housing stocks, tucked in between all those luxury homes and their owners of those homes. They have operated and existed as such over more than a century. Even when the annex itself was a neighborhood in transition, they maintained their existence. The tenants of these houses are post-secondary students attending nearby university and colleges. I do know that many of these houses, besides the negative connotations with regards to the social events that they run, also provide significant philanthropic contributions to the community and the city, blood drives, donations, forming executives on student councils, and engaged members of public other than what we continually see in the media and what we are prejudiced to be, and prejudiced to having certain social activities that we partake in on our streets and by our nearby neighbors. And those are my submissions to the committee.
Thank you, sir. Any questions of the deputant? Councilor DiGiorgio.
One very quick question. Christian, interested in your recommendation about 3 members of the sorority, sorority or fraternity not being able to live in a single building. You are aware that the provincial government has a regulation in place that a minimum of 3 unrelated people can live in a single family home in accordance with the Planning Act?
Yes.
So why do you think that 3 people, just because they happen to be members of a fraternity, should be excluded from that requirement?
My issue is that the city licensing is going to be asking for recommendation to have members of a particular group.
You're assuming we have licensing in place that will ask for certain things. I don't see any of that in the recommendations.
The recommendations are the building provides accommodations for more than 3 students who are members of an active chapter of a bona fide national international student fraternity or sorority. So my interpretation of that is that there's a requirement from licensing, if this recommendation is passed, that there has to be proof that these individuals are members of a group or association. And I don't believe that is in the purview of any regulatory regime to require somebody to be part of an interest group to be a resident of a particular property anywhere in this country.
All right, thanks.
Thank you, Chair and members.
Thank you. Speakers? All right, questions of staff, sorry. Okay, visiting Councilor Cressy.
Thank you. I'll direct these to Tracy. So currently, fraternities and sororities that are certified have an exemption, is that correct? Under an exemption as a rooming house?
Through you, Mr. Chair, yes, the bylaw 285, Section 8, subsection C is the exception for a student fraternity or sorority house under certain conditions.
Okay. When was that exemption put in place?
Through you, Mr. Chair, quite some time ago, 1983.
1983. So it states that they get an exemption if they're under certain conditions, if they're certified and, as a registered sorority or fraternity. Do they currently have to prove that affiliation, that certification?
Through you, Mr. Chair, no, they do not currently.
So they currently have an exemption, but they don't have to prove to the city that they warrant the exemption?
That is correct.
Okay, so there's a gap there.
So there is a gap there.
Okay. Do they have to provide contact information currently?
Through you, Mr. Chair, since they are accepted or exempted from the bylaw, there's no requirement for them to provide contact information or any engagement with the city in that respect.
Okay. Of the 19 fraternities and sororities that that currently have this exemption or that we're aware of, do we know how many people live there?
Through you, Mr. Chair, no, we do not.
Okay. With reporting, so if, as per the first recommendation, which is to prove that you warrant the exemption, will that information, the contact information, would that be made public if somebody, a local councillor, a local city division, wanted to get in touch to work on issues that may come up?
Through you, Mr. Chair, our discussions with the legal were that this type of information could form a matter of public record and would be available if requested.
Okay. In the report, it noted certain incidents. So there both complaints over the last 5 years, 166 complaints, as well as 78 police incidents. Have we seen a consistent and ongoing annual number of complaints and police incidents related to these locations?
So through you, Mr. Chair, we have provided in the report the number of complaints that we've received in each of the last 5 years. We've seen a slight decline in 2017 as far as reported complaints. From a policing perspective, it does appear those numbers are static, just noting that those are occurrences where the addresses were identified as it may be at or near. So they are not directly all attributed to the address specifically, but have been identified as the location. So, but the numbers are generally consistent.
Okay, and I'll go to Toronto Fire for a moment. Have any of these buildings ever been charged for violations of the fire code?
Through the chair, since January 1st of 2013 through today, Toronto Fire Service has sworn 4 informations against the 19 properties, 4 times against 4 properties for violations of the Ontario Fire Code.
Okay, and has Toronto Public, TPS, responded to fires or medical calls?
Through the chair, since January 1st, 2013, Toronto Fire Service has been called to these specific addresses 18 times for emergency medical calls.
And what, do we know the nature of those emergency medical calls?
Councillor, unfortunately, I don't have the specific incident reports for each type, but they are codified in our standard incident reports as emergency medical calls. So they would have to meet the tiered response agreement. So generally, when Toronto Fire is tiered with our colleagues at Toronto Paramedic Services, it's a higher threshold call than a scrape on the knee.
Okay, so it's okay. Could these buildings be deemed as a rooming house under the fire code?
Through the chair, notwithstanding the bylaw, on a case-by-case basis, yes. Again, rooming house enforcement is difficult on the best of days. But on a case-by-case basis, depending on the situation in the particular building, the Ontario Fire Code may be applied, and then we would just have to look at the essential elements that we would have to prove.
Okay, and just to be clear for all of us, because as we look to safety and accountability, as rooming houses, and perhaps to Tracy, so rooming houses have to be licensed currently where they're permitted.
Through you, Mr. Chair, that's correct. Okay,
and they require so in the old city of Toronto, in this area where they're permitted, biannual inspections around fire code, building code are required, is that right?
Through the chair to the councillor, they're required to have annual inspections by both fire and municipal licensing and standards.
Okay, so annual inspections on fire and
Thank you,
MLS.
Councillor. That would be your last question. if you
No,
want to
no,
finish
that's
that.
fine. Thank you
All right.
very much, Chair.
Thank you. Yeah, sorry.
I don't have any questions. I want to speak.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. So it was suggested through you. It was suggested by one of the deputants that the rooming, sorry, the rooming houses, the frats and sororities should be self-regulating. So I'm looking at the number of. We were talking about the number of complaints. It seems like the number one complaint, if I'm not mistaken, is waste. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So would that not be something that they could have already been, quote unquote, self-regulating?
Not necessarily self-regulated, but that we do have bylaws in place that, city bylaws in place that govern most of the complaints that are mentioned in the report.
Okay, let me rephrase that. What I'm saying is, if they were following any sort of code or standard of, I'll say, neighborly decency, would that not address a lot of their waste issues? Or are the waste issues, like, are they something about mixing recycling, for instance?
So through you, Mr. Chair, every person is entitled to regulate their conduct vis-a-vis the law that's in place. In this case, it's the waste bylaws. I don't know that I have specifics about the nature of the waste that was an issue, but we do have both our waste bylaw and our property standards bylaws that govern this.
Okay, thanks. So in terms of these biannual inspections or annual inspections with rooming houses that Councillor Cressley was referring to, this is actually through the speaker to the, well, let's start with Toronto Fire. Can you confirm that you've actually, I think the committee was led to believe that all these 19 houses, if you will, are up to code from the fire perspective. Can you confirm that they are?
Through the chair, I cannot. We are not required under any regulation or municipal code to inspect these specific 19 properties. The only time we would be in, which has been 29 times in the last 5 years, is on a complaint or a request for approval.
Okay, thanks. Through the chair to other staff, in terms of the building code, Health Protection and Promotion Act, and property standards bylaws, can we confirm that all 19 houses are up to par in those areas?
So through you, Mr. Chair, in the absence of a recent inspection, no, we cannot
Okay, thank you.
their.
And then I think my last question is, if we were to adopt these recommendations, what would the actual impact on the frats and sororities be, other than obviously the aforementioned questions that I just had? In terms of fire code, building code, I get all that stuff. What other impact would there be?
And the main impact to the fraternities and sororities would be them to validate their exemption and to provide us with a contact name at the local residence and then the international affiliation.
Okay, so what happens if they have some loud parties?
We would then have the ability to have a direct contact that we do not have now and try to work with them to minimize the noise.
Say they don't.
And through you, Mr. Chair, they would still be subject to the existing bylaws that govern conduct, irrespective of us having a name or not.
Right, so I guess my point is the concern that you might be drastically changing their lifestyle. Would we have any ability, based on loud noise and parties, to actually shut them down if we were to adopt these recommendations?
Through you, Mr. Chair, no, that is not the case. The recommendations in front of you today simply require proof for the exception that currently exists and providing information for registration purposes so we have somebody to contact. The other recommendations, one makes some clarity on a definition. The third talks about future work to be done. Just to be clear, that the licensing or any registration does not preclude or exempt people from all the rest of the bylaws that they're required to comply with, or other laws and statutes federally and provincially.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions of staff? All right, then I will move to speakers. Visiting Councilor Cressy.
Thank you, and I won't take the full 5 minutes here. First of all, I just want to thank our MLS staff for all their hard work on this over the last year, Carlton and Tracy and co. I want to thank the many local stakeholders, residents, and businesses we've heard from. The University of Toronto, who are supportive of this measure. I want to quote from the president of the University of Toronto, Merrick Ertler's letter. To reiterate a point that was made when this matter was first considered, the University of Toronto does not recognize or have any relationship with fraternities and sororities. That said, we share the local community's desire for safe, livable neighborhoods and are particularly cognizant of the safety of U of T students and willing to support any measure to help their safety. Listen, the local community supports these measures. The University of Toronto supports these measures. The University of Toronto student associations support these measures, and I support these measures. And so this is simply about safety and accountability. Don't let it become about anything else. It's about safety of the residents of these sites, of the visitors to these sites, and of the local community, and accountability to the city and the community. I'll just say very quickly, and we've heard it extensively here, that currently sororities and fraternities exist in a gray area. There is a regulatory void that exists. They provide housing. We don't know to how many people. We don't know the contact information for the 19 sites that provide housing, but they provide this housing without any city regulatory framework around property standards, fire, and others. And so this is a long overdue initiative to address ongoing issues relating to noise and garbage and property standards and safety. It's supported by everybody, it seems, except some fraternities. I have not heard from a single person other than a representative for fraternities who can't name which fraternities he represents. And so I would just close by saying I can't for the life of me understand why any are opposed. I can't for the life of me understand how this is seen as a threatening action as opposed to something which is just common sense. And this is not at all about whether or not we shut down fraternities. It has nothing to do with that. It's about safety and accountability. And I will tell you to members of council here that when I got elected, and this goes back decades, but when I got elected, I reached out to a representative, somebody who claimed to be a representative for the 19 sites. And I said I would be willing to engage in a meeting with a representative of each of the 19 sites to talk about protocols and standards and how we work together. And the answer was, you only speak to me. You heard from that deputant today. I can't find out who the sites are. I can't find a contact information for the site. I can't do my job, and the residents continue to struggle, and I'm worried about the safety. Like, look at these numbers from the police. And so, let's just get on with it. It's long overdue. Thank you.
Councilor Burnside.
Thank you. I am very aware that the frats and sororities have probably been or located where they are for longer than any resident. So to an extent, when residents move into the area, they kind of know what they're getting. All that said, these recommendations are it's pretty basic. It's basic stuff. And unfortunately, the representatives against these recommendations were unable to tell, certainly to my satisfaction, to tell us why they're such a bad idea. And I don't think I have to urge everyone to support it because I think that's the way it's going anyway, but thank you.
Councilor Nunziata.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do have a motion that recommendation 1 from the Executive Director Municipal License Standard be replaced with the following. Okay. I'm not going to read it out, by deleting subsection and so forth. May be required to be licensed as set out in Chapter 285. I'm moving that because, I've listened to the residents and to some of the community members, and as well as reading the letter that was David Stearns sent to the mayor. They did have an opportunity a few years ago to clean up their act and to actually work with the community and try to address some of the concerns that the community had. But obviously, they haven't, and it's worse now than it was a few years ago. And so we, I think we have a responsibility to protect the residents that live in that area, that are constantly having to have complaints about noise, garbage, and calling the police over and over again. I know that if it was in my ward, I'm dealing with other issues similar to that, or in Councillor DeGiorgio's ward, we would want to have some sort of licensing and brought under control rather than it escalate. So I'm moving that amendment, and hoping that members of the committee will support me.
Questions of the mover?
Aren't we supposed to have a consultation process?
I believe that they already did a few years ago.
So there's nothing more that we're consulting about?
Well, Councillor Burnside, this has been going on for years, and it doesn't seem like anything has been resolved over the years. So I think that we have a responsibility to protect the residents and people that live in that area with their concerns. So I'm moving that motion.
So, okay, I'm just looking at the recommendation number 3. I'm trying to understand why staff would recommend number 3. Can I ask staff that question? Or am I done on my questions?
Can't,
Okay, let me ask you this. Might you know why staff recommended number 3?
Yeah, to develop a criteria, but I've spoken to staff and they're fine with my amendment, Councillor Burnside.
Okay, thanks.
To speak? Or, well, if you don't, I got questions off the mover, if I may. Councillor, thank you very much for bringing this forward. I think that will bring everything in order, but my question to you is this: how will this affect areas that right now do not have rooming houses? This is not your intention, is it?
Yeah.
So would you be looking at a friendly amendment that it says so that a registered student fraternity or sorority house, we can put the word registered in front?
Yeah, that's fine, Councillor.
Okay, thank you very much. All right, any speakers? Okay. Councillor DeGiorgio.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do want to support Councillor Nunziata's motion, but my instinct tells me that the matter should be referred back to staff and to have them come forward with such a recommendation once they do further consultation and whatnot. As itemized in 3, I think for us to take this action would bring forward some challenges that would be successful. And I'm just very leery that we should proceed in this matter. Even though at the end of the day, there might be some way of doing it, I just want to make sure that staff get some legal opinions on whether we can proceed the way this motion is recommending. So my preference is to refer it. If that fails, I will support it.
Okay, thank you. Can I ask of staff if this is in order, if this motion is in order? Gentlemen, councillors, can I ask of staff if this motion is in order? Please.
Yeah, so procedurally, this is the subject of the report. It is properly before the committee in our view.
Okay, thank you. Other speakers? All right. Can we vote on the amendment, please? Can we vote on Councillor Nunziata's motion? You want a recorded vote, or, okay, in favor? You're moving a referral? All right. On. All right. Are you requesting that we refer the item? We cannot refer a motion. You will withdraw your request for referral. Okay. All right. Okay, we'll head from staff that it's in order. All those in favor of Councilor Nunziata's motion? Against? Passed. Item as amended. All those in favor? Opposed? Pass. Thank you. All right. Next item is LS 25.3, Review of Municipal Code, Chapter 447, Fences. We do have some speakers. First speaker is Robert Wood. Mr. Wood, are you looking for some technical support? Are you looking for some technical support? All right, somebody's coming over to help you, and then we'll get you going. All right, sir. Mr. Wood, you got 5 minutes. We're ready to go, sir. Starting now.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, city, staff, and visitors. My name is Robert Wood. I'm the Executive Director of the Pool and Hot Tub Council of Canada. There is always an easy solution to every human problem. Neat, plausible, and wrong. This expression is attributed to H.L. Mencken, and I believe he may have intended it for use in just such an occasion. The Pool and Hot Tub Council of Canada supports the use of four-sided isolation fencing, especially for families with young children. As an industry, we install them regularly across the country. Isolation fencing can be an effective barrier and has proven so. However, there are other modern alternatives that are every bit as effective. We fear that the mandating of four-sided fencing as the only solution is holding back progress in terms of drowning prevention for toddlers. A layered approach to water safety is what we strongly endorse. Let's look at some of the statistics. In 2003, Australia enacted legislation making isolation fencing around swimming pools mandatory. Yes, it did provide some initial success in reducing the number of infant drownings, and it should have. 2 Australian states had no fencing regulations in place 15 years ago, not even three-sided fencing. However, mandated four-sided fencing has proven to be far from a panacea. As you can see by the results, things have plateaued. This is why Australia is presently rethinking its policy. Similar results befell New Zealand, which rescinded its law in November of 2016. New Zealand now allows a variety of options to the homeowner, including the use of door alarms. The same outcome occurred in France, which amended its law to permit the use of pool shelters.
Absolutely.
What caused these results? This is not just an issue about physical barriers, but about human behavior. People who leave a back door open can also leave a gate open. If we provide citizens with choices, they are more likely to embrace one or more of them. It is only then that we will see further progress in terms of drowning prevention. I would like to note that proponents of mandated four-sided fencing have traditionally quoted the 1982 works of Dr. Vimpani and the 1990 research findings of Dr. Wintermute. Their studies were made years in advance of the development of many of the modern digital safeguards that are available today. In 2009, I tracked down Dr. Wintermute over the telephone, and we discussed the Toronto bylaw. He voiced surprise that more up-to-date technologies were not being encouraged. Naturally, his recommendations for fencing on all 4 sides were taken literally at the time of publication. What he was suggesting was that a barrier be put into place as a deterrent to access pools. At the time, he stipulated a fence because that was what was available then. As someone educated in science, I admit that this observation is purely anecdotal. Nevertheless, it should prompt us to pause and think. Society turns to industry to find solutions to problems. It is exasperating to come up with practical and logical solutions to problems, and yet decisions are taken based on technologies of a generation ago. Moreover, it is disappointing that the current bylaw is actually discouraging the use of door alarms,
pool safety covers, enclosures, and the like. A few years ago, we met with the Deputy Coroner of Ontario, Dr. Lowers, and spoke about his recommendation of four-sided fencing. He agreed that four-sided fencing is not all the be-all and end-all. He himself had a near-drowning experience with his own family, and his child was only inches away from him. We agreed that adult supervision and education, along with supplementary layers of safety, would be a good approach to drowning prevention for young children. We're looking forward to being part of the next draft of recommendations the Chief Coroner's Office prepares. The original report studied several drownings that took place 8 years ago. Sadly, 3 of the 7 toddlers that were addressed in that report had drowned where four-sided fencing was indeed in place. 2 other children drowned accessing 5-foot walls of above-ground pools. Details on the other 2 drowning victims were unavailable. Certainly a lot more is now known about this issue and the effectiveness of available safeguards. The Pool and Hot Tub Council of Canada takes drowning prevention extremely seriously. We've spent well over $100,000 just in the province of Ontario in the past 5 years on drowning prevention campaigns. I think we all agree that our target age for drowning prevention is children under the age of 5. For the families that fall into this category, there's a list of several options to choose from that provide effective physical barriers and also supplementary safeguards that provide additional protection. However, when it comes to protecting young children, there's absolutely no substitute for adult supervision. The current bylaw clearly misses the mark. A couple of seniors with no small children who decides to install a backyard pool is required to erect isolation fencing. This is like telling them they must deploy a child car safety seat in their vehicle. On the other hand, a family with young children that moves to an established home in Toronto that just happens to have a pool on the property that was built in October 2007, no isolation fence is required. Does this make any sense whatsoever?
Thank you, sir. Your time is up.
Thank you.
Any questions of the deputant? Go ahead.
Thanks. Besides your concerns about efficacy, what is your big objection?
Our largest exception, or our
concern?
The biggest concern that we have against the existing bylaw in terms of missing the mark, it's not really protecting young children in some instances, and we need, we're not arguing against the fact we need barriers. What we'd like to do is give the residents a choice of the barrier that's best for them. If they don't like it, and a lot of people, there's some people in this room I've talked to, loathe the four-sided fence. They don't like it. They have children that are 8 years old or older, they can hop over the fence. They just seen it as a nuisance, and they ask our companies, can we take down the fence? And we say no.
So I may have missed it, but did you, what are the alternatives?
Oh, I was showing them.
Oh yeah, I missed that little part, okay.
It's in your kit there.
In the kit? Okay, I'll check that out
You'll
then.
see a number of them. Automated pool covers, that's one of them. The shelters is another one.
The hard covers you're talking about?
That's right. It's the automated ones too. That's only
Same
one
as like
push.
with a jacuzzi or something?
Yeah.
Okay.
And even alarms at our back door would suffice as well. If, you know.
Okay, so just on that kind of makes sense, but with a fence, you don't have to, I mean, I guess you have to close the gate. Apart from that.
The tape that automatically closes.
But with the other thing, with the automatic pool cover, is there not a concern that people may not remember to cover?
Anyone who invests in one, the name of it is Automated Safety Pool Cover. They obviously believe heavily in safety. They've spent over $8,500, and these gentlemen could correct me if I'm wrong with the price, but they're very expensive. $20,000. Anyone who spends that type of money on it, it's just a push of a button to close it. It slides.
Well, no, it's a memory thing more than anything, right? Okay, thanks.
I thank you very much, sir. Any other questions of the deputant? Fantastic, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
We have a motion that I believe Councillor Francis wants to move, and that motion is that we extend until we finish this item.
So what was that, Councillor Francis?
Nunziata, Madam Speaker.
Yes, Jim.
Not a problem.
I'll move to finish the item.
All right, thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thank you, Councillor Nunziata. It's like it. All right, next speaker, I got Marcus Brunner.
I regret,
Marcus
Mr.
Brunner.
Chairman, he was had to attend to a family emergency back in London, Ontario.
Okay, thank you, sir. Appreciate it. Please convey our best wishes to him. Kathy David.
Mr. Chair, I'm speaking on the hedge only, so I would suggest that the last speaker go before me because she's speaking about.
As you wish. If you want to change places, by all means. Tessa Clemens.
Thank you. My name is Tessa Clemens. I have a PhD in injury epidemiology from York University, and I'm currently a research fellow at Sick Kids Hospital. So I wanted to share some of my research with you, which relates to this topic. My PhD research focused on drowning prevention, and one of the projects I undertook was specifically on child drowning in private backyard pools. So for this study, I reviewed all drowning deaths in Ontario that occurred in private backyard pools among children over a 15-year period. So that was from 1999 to 2013. During the study period, 54 children under the age of 5 drowned in a private backyard pool in Ontario. And when fence information was available from the files, which was in 80% of the cases, the majority occurred in 3-sided or perimeter fenced pools. Approximately 60% of the children in the study accessed the pool directly from the residence, totally unobstructed. And these are the type of drowning deaths that could have been prevented by 4-sided isolation fencing with a self-closing, self-latching gate. 1/4 of the children in the study drowned in the private backyard pool of a relative or friend's home, suggesting the need for all backyard pools to have mandated isolation fencing, not just those with a toddler who actually lives in the home. The majority of children were alone at the time of the incident, but in over half of these cases, it's because supervision was present but distracted at the immediate moment of the incident. So this demonstrates that relying solely on alternative approaches such as adult supervision may not be effective. I'd also like to mention that the data for this study was fatality data only, and it doesn't consider any of the non-fatal drowning incidents that occur among children under 5. We know that there's actually children under 5 are at an increased risk of non-fatal drowning, and the majority of these cases also happen in private backyard pools. The World Health Organization recommends that 4-sided isolation pool fencing with self-closing and self-latching gates be both legislated and enforced. Local organizations that use evidence-based approaches, including the Office of the Chief Coroner for Ontario and Parachute Canada, which is our national injury prevention organization, both also support this recommendation. Evidence does exist for 4-sided isolation fencing. A Cochrane systematic review on backyard pool fencing that was published in 2000 was published in 2000. So Cochrane reviews are the leading source of systematic reviews in healthcare, and they synthesize the highest level of scientific evidence on a topic through a rigorous process. This review indicated that 4-sided isolation fencing significantly reduced the risk of child drowning compared to 3-sided perimeter fencing. So evidence on other methods of preventing private backyard pool drownings that have been brought to my attention since this review was conducted have been anecdotal in nature. Since the Cochrane Review, no rigorous scientific studies have been conducted to evaluate the effectiveness of other approaches in reducing the risk of child drowning in backyard pools. We can also draw upon knowledge from other areas of injury prevention that have indicated that, in general, passive prevention strategies that do not require behavior change on the part of the individual, such as physical barriers, and legislation and enforcement are more effective than active prevention strategies such as supervision and public education. While I do believe that several approaches are required to keep children safe around pools, I believe that a very important one of these approaches are 4-sided isolation fencing, and that maintaining this requirement in the City of Toronto bylaws is important to ensure the safety of children in Toronto. I'm pleased to see that staff did not recommend removing this requirement, and based on the existing scientific evidence from other countries and my own review of all child backyard pool drowning deaths in Ontario, I urge the committee to maintain the requirement for 4-sided isolation fencing with self-closing and self-latching gates. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions? Go ahead, Councillor.
Thanks. I just missed that one statistic. You said children drowning it was non-residents. So they weren't residents of the, what was the percentage?
1/4. So 1/4 of the children who fatally drowned in Ontario in a 15-year period drown in the backyard pool of a home that wasn't their own home.
Friend, family, whatever, something like that.
Exactly.
So 3/4 died where in the, their parents basically owned
Either in
their own yard.
home or a neighbor's home, but the neighbor is very rare. And that's the type of drowning that perimeter fencing would protect. But yes, the majority did occur in the child's own home.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Oh, sorry, we do have one last. Kathy. David, please.
Mr. Vice Chair, members of the committee and municipal licensing staff, thank you for the opportunity of speaking on the matter of changes to the fence bylaw. I will be speaking specifically in regard to the proposed elimination of the height of hedges from the fence bylaw. To my knowledge, hedge heights are not covered in any other bylaw. I'm here to say that hedge heights should absolutely remain in the fence bylaw and even be made lower in rear yards. One of the basic reasons is that hedges are difficult to maintain beyond this height. Overgrown hedges need specialist equipment or professional help to reduce their height. The work is beyond the skills and the resources available to the ordinary property owner. And it's often the neighbor that is doing the maintaining. To trim the hedge shown here on the screen, I have to climb up on the roof of my garage. The top of the hedge is now too high to reach with a pole pruner. Also, I can no longer stand on the roof of the garage because it is structurally unsound, and my right of entry application, for which I was required to pay a high impact permit fee of over $100,000, was denied. And this hedge is literally rotting the side off of the garage. Secondly, hedge heights block sunlight from neighboring properties. Sunlight is needed on city properties to fuel solar panels, heat pools, and for growing flowering plants and vegetables, and for the overall enjoyment of one's properties. Here are some initiatives. These are 3 initiatives that promote urban agriculture for food security in Toronto and the planting of flowers for pollinators. The Grow TO Urban Agriculture Action Plan was unanimously approved by City Council in 2012, and Cultivating Food Connections, published by the Toronto Public Health in 2010, outlines strategies to encourage the growth of urban agriculture, including in rear yards. Both call for policies that support and facilitate the growing of food. The draft of the Toronto Pollinator Protection Plan in 2017 outlines and encourages the enhancement of habitat for pollinators such as bees and butterflies. Eliminating hedge heights from the fence bylaw would be totally contrary to these initiatives. 6 to 8 hours of sunlight are required to grow healthy flowering plants and vegetables. Hedge heights need to be maintained at least less than 2 meters to ensure yards have sufficient sunlight for these initiatives. Finally, there are other adverse effects of hedges. This hedge has caused an adjacent neighbor to fill in their rear pool because the hedge was blocking sunlight required for solar heating. The hedge harbors raccoons, and raccoon feces and urine are associated with diseases such as roundworm, giardia, and leptospirosis. And also, hedges create moist, shady conditions that harbor mosquitoes. I have a greater chance of contracting West Nile virus in my rear yard than I do in a cottage in Northern Ontario. And this is a diagram showing the testing of mosquito groups that are positive, and you can see the cluster around Toronto, whereas Northern Ontario has hardly any pools of mosquitoes that contain West Nile virus. If the city wants to modernize their bylaws and be consistent with their initiatives to promote urban agriculture, they should be lowering the height limits of fences and hedges to allow yards to receive as much sunlight as possible. Any fence should either be open lattice or chain link to allow sun penetration. I also think that hedges should be planted a meter from the property line and be required to be maintained by their owner. The meter setback would allow the hedge owner to trim along the property line or away from adjacent buildings so that neighbors are not burdened with having to trim hedges that are not their own. So I'm asking you not to not approve the removal of hedge heights from the bylaw.
Ma'am, 10 seconds to wrap up, please. Thank you.
I would also suggest fence bylaw be made more transparent by renaming it the Fences and Hedges bylaw, so people know where to find the hedge height.
Thank you, ma'am. Any questions? Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Questions of staff, right? Any questions of staff? Councillor Nunziata, and I got it right this time.
No, just one question. So why is it that we have, we removed the maximum height requirements for hedges? What was the reason for that?
Through the chair to Councillor Nunziata. So we were proposing to remove a hedge that's acting as a fence. So if the hedge, for instance, is in your backyard and you have a fence, we currently don't regulate the height of that hedge. So we're bringing equality to that issue. So if it's not acting as a fence, there's no restrictions on the height of a hedge. So we felt that it would not be practical to impose that same, more stringent standard on a hedge just because of physically it's a couple of inches or maybe a foot closer to the property line.
Hedges that are at the front, there are some homes that have hedges all along the front yard and that, so there would be a maximum height for those.
That we are still addressing, yes.
Yeah,
for
that's
line
like,
of
that will cause an issue.
yes.
Yeah.
So we're not proposing for hedges along the front property line or where there's a line of sight issue, sight triangle around driveways, that would not.
That would still remain. Okay, thanks.
Correct.
Any other, Councillor DiGiorgio?
Yep, two quick questions. Mrs. Grega, we're not recommending any exemptions or any additional permissiveness to the, let's say, rear yard fences that are currently at a maximum of 2 meters?
Through the
or
chair,
side yards to that extent? Or side yards? No,
No, we are not.
One of the issues that I've had with respect to hedges, you know, being allowed to grow over and over, and if it's on very close to the property line, typically there are some overhanging branches and there are problems caused for adjoining neighbors, and that's what really creates the problem. It's not so much the cosmetics of what a hedge looks like, but sometimes there are problems with abutting neighbors. And so how do we propose to deal with that? Do we invariably ask, let's say if I have a hedge on my property and overhanging branches on my neighbor's property, is it my responsibility to clear their, or to make sure that the hedge doesn't overlap onto their property or not?
Through the chair to Councillor DiGiorgio, it's no different than a tree and overhanging limbs and branches from a tree. The property owner who it's overhanging onto has their rights to deal with those overhanging branches themselves.
All right, that's fair. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. I do also have a couple of questions of staff. Right now, the back fence of a house, I believe it's 6 feet, or sorry, 8 feet, 2 meters type of thing?
To the chair, it's 2 meters, which is 6 foot 6 inches in imperial dimensions.
So if a hedge is more than 2 meters in the back, are we saying today to allow it to grow even more?
to the chair. So currently, if we treated that hedge as a fence, it would be restricted to a maximum 2-meter height under the current provisions of our fence bylaw. We are proposing to remove that restriction because if you have a fence, say you have a chain link fence along your backyard, and on your side of that chain link fence, you have a row of cedar hedges. Those would not be restricted in how high they could grow. They could grow 20 feet tall if you so chose. So we're trying to say, let's treat them, a hedge as a hedge, let's treat it the same, and we don't regulate the height of hedges.
So what you're saying, if there's a hedge between two houses and that hedge goes to be about 20 feet, that's okay? This is what we're proposing?
Well, currently, if it's just a hedge, and if it was not on the boundary line acting as a fence, there is no restrictions to that. And
But if it's on the boundary line?
Currently, our bylaw would consider that a fence, and we restrict that to the heights of as it would be a fence.
So is the thing today that we're discussing to remove that?
That's correct.
All right, thank you. Speakers?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think the clerks have a motion. I'm going to just move the staff recommendations and ask that for a staff report back on the feasibility of delegating fence exemption requests to the executive director, MLS. The reason I think our staff should have a look at this is because as members of community council, we all know, and when you read through the staff report, we get a lot of fence exemption requests. They're usually two neighbors fighting over 1 foot, sometimes 2 inches, 6 inches, sometimes 10 feet. I had one neighbor who famously in my ward went around with a clipboard and put in complaints against 100 different property owners, against hedges that had been there for 30 years, 50 years. People bought the house 25 years ago and said, well, the hedge hasn't changed in 25 years, but because of certain bylaws, the way they were written, they were non-compliant, and our inspectors would say, well, sorry, this is a violation. It was a bit of a mess, but certainly at community council, we're spending, like in Scarborough, we have 10 councillors sometimes listening to two neighbors debate and fight each other over a 6-inch or 12-inch variance on a hedge or a fence. And I would say, with all the staff around the chamber as well, that's a lot of resources listening to two neighbors who sometimes it's not even the hedge or the fence, it's that, well, that neighbor plays loud music and I don't like him, or this neighbor hasn't liked me because I come from a different country than he comes from, and you're sit there as a councillor surrounded by staff fighting over a 1-foot variance of a hedge, and you think, is this really about the hedge, or is this because you each come from the same country, but different regions of the country, and decided you don't like each other anymore, and people are finding reasons to complain about each other. I think in the Works Department, we used to have an issue with the drain grant program, where, again, people would come to the Works Committee seeking for drain grants, and we would have the whole committee and all of the senior staff around the chamber listen while somebody argued whether they should get a $2,000 or $2,500 grant or not, even after staff sometimes would have rejected them. So I think it's worth having a look at. The staff may say yes, it's feasible, or no, it's not, but just like committee of adjustment things, I mean, we shouldn't be as a community council looking at minor variances. I think our staff have a professional process in place, and I think if they build in an appeal mechanism like we did at the Works Department with the drain grants, I think the residents in the end would be happier, councillors would be happier, it'd be more efficient use of our time, and we wouldn't be there as councillors looking at two different residents both getting mad at the councillor because they both want you to solve a problem that really you can't solve. So again, I'm happy to see that we're maintaining some of the bylaws for swimming pools. I do think they work, and our staff have been very cooperative in my ward, so I'm happy to move the recommendations.
Questions of the motion?
Would you have a problem with leaving it up to staff to determine whether trees should be removed?
I'd be happy with that too.
Oh, okay.
Not staff. community council. I think that's what he meant.
No, but this leaves this up to staff.
I would be happy with, well, his question was about staff. I'd be happy with staff doing that.
Why
Because,
don't we leave everything up to staff? I mean, we're not really needed.
well, I think we should be voting on $3 billion subways, $1 billion rail deck parks.
Staff are the
Sorry,
professionals. They could handle that too.
councillors,
Finch
this is
Avenue
not clarification
LRTs.
of the motion. I appreciate the back and forth, but this is not clarification
I
of the
think
motion.
my motion's intent is to allow, I'll call it some of these minor issues to be dealt with in an administrative matter, not take up councillors' time. I'd rather, we just passed a motion on a 550-unit seniors building or development proposal in my ward a couple days ago at Community Council. That's where I think you and I should be spending our time with development proposals and all the things that we should be doing, not whether your fence is 6 inches too high and your neighbor, Mrs. Nunziata, is complaining about your extra 6 inches because she doesn't like you anymore.
Councillor, I have a couple of questions. What mechanism would, in rights of appeal, would people have? There's just nothing here. I mean, you don't go to an elected body to you know, this motion doesn't speak about an appeal process, does not speak, you go to an elected body to bring your process forward. I thank you for bringing it forward, but I don't think that I'm ready to give up powers that I was given as an elected official to staff. So,
In terms of clarification, I guess it's not said, so I'd consider it a friendly amendment if we put an appeal process. When I talked to Mr. DiGeronimo, there is an appeal process for the Drain Grant Program, so if somebody doesn't like a staff answer and they do think they've been treated unfairly or improperly or there's been a mistake, there is an appeal process. So I think I'll include that language. I made the assumption that staff, when they write the report, would include an appeal process.
So if we're talking about an appeal process, then, Councillor, where would it go? Would it go to Community Council, or would it go again back to staff?
I would leave that for the staff investigation to come back and say what they think is the best and most appropriate course of action. But I agree with you, there should be an appeal process. I made an assumption there'd be an appeal process, so I'm happy to add that, offense exemption requests and appeals.
When do you want this back?
The executive director and/or.
Do you want to have a time frame on this to come back?
I would leave that up to staff for a time frame. First quarter, yeah, that first quarter of
2019. All right, so you're agreeable with first quarter 2019?
Quarter two, so maybe second quarter.
Second quarter of 2019, and you're also agreeing to an appeal process?
Include an appeal process that the staff would come back to us with, yeah. Yes.
All right. Yes, to speak, Councillor DiGiorgio.
Yeah, like, to be honest, I cannot see the difference of the policy we have in place right now, where staff makes decisions on fence exemptions, and if people aren't happy, they bring it forward to the community council. So the appeal process is in place. I'm not sure how they're going to alter that appeal process. So I'm a little bit befuddled. No, I know, but every fence exemption goes to staff now, period. They go, if somebody's asking for an exemption,
Councillor,
they must make an
you're
application.
speaking. If you don't like it, vote against it.
I think that's the process that's in place, and all we're going to get back is...
Councillor? Okay. Thank you. Anybody else to speak? Well, I'll address the issue. I'm a little bit skeptical about allowing, we call them these monstrosities to grow. I've seen things in my hedges in my area where they're about 30 feet high, 40 feet high. People cannot see through them. And the person says, well, that's my fence. And if I put on a wooden fence or a chain link fence, I can only do it for 6 feet, 6 inches. Why then should you, that wants to put a hedge up, have it go up to 20 feet? Where's the reality of this? And then if it's a corner house, as I have 2 of them, they are forced to cut the heads in the front, and around the back, they are overhanging on people's, on the sidewalk and everything else. So I will not be supporting this. As far as Councillors Glenda Beerberger's motion, we do have a system that works right now. I thank the staff for bringing, for the work that they're doing. But at the end of the day, I am not ready as an elected official to give up the tools that people that elected me have given me. I'm there to mitigate between folks, and I'm there to listen to both, and people come to us and say, okay, we want some solutions. If this is a means of us like sort of walking away and not answering them, I think that we have to come back to think seriously that we need to answer what constituents are bringing us. This is what is happening right now. If a tree has to be cut, if it has to be done, the staff try to do it, and if people disagree with staff and they want to make appeal mechanism, they come to us. So that already exists. So I'm not sure, although I did some friendly amendments, that I will be supporting it. And with that, I'm going to close, and I'm going to see, I see if Councillor Nunziata has...
I wasn't going to speak, but just a few words, that I will be supporting Councillor de Beermaker's motion because really all he's asking for is a report to come back in second quarter of 2019. So at that point, we'll see what the report is, and if there's any amendments, whatever that need to be added, that's fine. But I want the clothing boxes to come back first. Thank you.
All right. Any other speakers? Nope. Okay. We have a motion by Councillor de Beermaker. I'm asking for a recorded vote. All those in favor? Councillor Nunziata, Councillor Glenda Beermaker. Against? Councillor DeGiorgio, and myself, Jim Karagianis. Okay. You can move in council, definitely. All right, we have staff recommendations. All in favor? Recorded vote. Councillor Francis Nunziata, Councillor DeGiorgio, Councillor de Beermaker. Against? Jim Karagianis. Motion is amended. We're all right. Thank you. Appreciate it. All right. Thank you, councillors. Thank you, staff. Have a great weekend, everybody.